Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in somewhere comfortable if you can. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the room grow quieter around you. Because tonight we are stepping into a kind of American past that is often remembered through stock markets, railroad failures, bank runs, and stern men in dark suits arguing over money in newspaper columns. But that is not where we are going to stay. We are going to follow the crisis all the way down to the kitchen table, to the pantry shelf, to the bread heel saved for morning, to the mother who looks into a cupboard and already knows there is not enough there, to the child who asks for a second helping and is told gently, not tonight. The Panic of 1893 was a financial disaster, yes, but for ordinary people, it became something much more immediate than finance. It became hunger. Not always the dramatic hunger of famine photographs or empty fields. Often it arrived in quieter ways. A meal thinned with more water, meat disappearing from the table, coffee stretched, bread bought one loaf at a time, a father leaving the house before sunrise to search for work and returning with the same empty hands he carried out the door. That is the world we're entering tonight. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening late at night, when the whole house has settled, and even small sounds seem louder than they should? Are you in bed, on a couch, in a chair, by a lamp, or somewhere far from home with this playing quietly beside you? If you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments. I genuinely love seeing where these stories find people. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy history told slowly and close to the ground, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like whenever it feels right. No rush. We have time tonight. And the people whose lives we're about to enter did not have much of that. They lived in a world where one lost shift could matter, one failed bank could erase years of savings, and one bad season of unemployment could turn the ordinary act of eating into a daily calculation. Let us begin in the summer of 1893. Not in a banker's office, though plenty of trouble was gathering there. Not on Wall Street, though newspapers were already filling with grim financial reports. Let us begin instead in an American city, perhaps Chicago, perhaps Pittsburgh, perhaps Cleveland or Philadelphia, in a rented room where the air feels heavy even after sunset, and the windows are open because there is no other relief from the heat. A family sits at supper. The father has worked with his hands for years, maybe in a rail shop, maybe in a steel mill, maybe loading freight, cutting lumber, laying track, driving wagons, shaping metal, tending machines that are loud enough to leave a ringing behind the eyes even after the factory whistle stops. The mother has spent the day keeping house under conditions that would exhaust most modern people before noon. She has washed clothes, watched children, stretched food, stood in line at a grocer who may or may not extend credit next week. The children are hungry in the ordinary way children are hungry. They expect food. They assume adults have arranged the world so that food appears. That is what childhood does. It trusts. The adults know something has changed. They do not yet know how bad it will become, but they can feel it gathering. Orders are slowing. Men at the plant have been sent home early. Someone on the next block has lost his job. A neighbour's savings are trapped in a bank that has shut its doors. The grocer's tone has become more careful. The landlord's has become less so. The Panic of 1893 did not strike every household in the same hour or in the same way, but across the country the pattern began to repeat with terrible familiarity. Financial confidence cracked. Banks suspended payments or failed. Railroads, which had expanded wildly in the decades after the Civil War and stood at the centre of American business life, collapsed under debt and weak credit. Factories tied to railroad construction and industrial demand slowed or closed. Workers who had believed that a hard job was at least a steady job suddenly discovered that steadiness had been an illusion. The crisis became one of the most severe economic contractions the United States had experienced up to that point. Historians have long debated the exact measurement of unemployment during those years because the government did not yet collect labour statistics, with the later precision Americans would come to expect. But the broad picture is not in doubt. Joblessness climbed sharply and remained painfully high through much of the mid-1890s, with one major historical estimate placing unemployment above 10% for half a decade. Now pause with that for a moment, because a percentage can flatten a human experience until it becomes almost meaningless. 10% unemployment does not sound like an empty chair at the table. It does not sound like boots wearing thin while a man walks from shop to shop, asking for work that does not exist. It does not sound like a woman cutting slices of bread more narrowly than she did last month. It does not sound like a child learning not to ask too quickly whether there is more stew. But that is what the percentage meant once it entered a neighbourhood. It meant one man out of work, then 3, then 10. It meant the boarding house keeper losing tenants, the butcher carrying less inventory because fewer people could pay, the laundress finding clients late on bills. The Church Benevolence Committee overwhelmed, the Mutual Aid Society forced to choose which family could be helped first. It meant hunger spreading not like a thunderclap, but like damp through plaster, quietly, gradually, then suddenly everywhere. The Federal Reserve's historical overview of the period notes that the crisis struck a far more industrial and interconnected society than earlier panics had. While no comprehensive public safety net yet existed to catch the newly jobless, that combination matters. It meant that when wages stopped, many households had little between themselves and need except savings, family, charity, or luck. This is one reason the Panic of 1893 deserves to be remembered not only as a financial event but as a food story. America in the 1890s was not a poor country in the simplest sense. Grain moved in enormous quantities. Meatpacking plants processed animals by the thousands. Railroads carried flour, corn, beef, pork, canned goods, sugar, coffee, and every other necessity through a vast national market. There was food in the country. There was food in warehouses. There was food passing in freight cars through cities where families could not afford to buy enough of it. That is a very modern kind of cruelty, and it was already visible in 1893. Hunger did not always come because food had vanished. It came because money had vanished first. The food remained in shop windows, in barrels, in crates, in markets, in advertisements promising wholesome abundance to anyone with the coins to claim it. And when the coins stopped coming, abundance became something you could stand near without touching. The strange thing about hunger during an economic panic is that it often begins with manners. People try to preserve the appearance that nothing is wrong. The father says he's already eaten while out looking for work. The mother claims she's not very hungry. Older children are told to wait a little while before taking seconds. A lunch pail comes home lighter, then emptier, then is no longer packed because there is nowhere to carry it. Credit is requested with embarrassment and granted with hesitation. An overdue grocer's account sits folded inside a drawer. A pawn ticket appears beside it. A coat disappears from a peg. Then a watch. Then bedding. Hunger enters politely at first, because pride tries to delay it. Families do not wake one morning and declare themselves destitute. They negotiate with destitution. They bargain. They rearrange. They tell themselves next week will improve, and sometimes it does. But during the Panic of 1893, for many households, next week arrived carrying worse news than the last. Contemporary newspapers were already reporting by late August 1893 that factories were closing and unemployed people were demanding bread, a stark sign that the crisis had reached well beyond financial offices and into public life. Let us stay with that rented room a little longer. The supper may be potatoes if they are available and cheap. Bread certainly, though perhaps not as much as the children want. Maybe cabbage boiled down until its smell fills the room. Beans if there was enough foresight or enough money to buy them earlier in the week. Meat may still appear, but less often, in smaller pieces, stretched across a pot rather than served as a clear portion. Coffee may be weak, butter may be gone. Milk may be purchased more cautiously, especially if there are many children. The meal is not nothing. That is important. Hunger in this period was often not the complete absence of food, but the steady decline in quality, quantity, and certainty. A family might eat every day and still be underfed. A child might not collapse in the street and still go to sleep unsatisfied. A worker might continue hunting for employment while gradually losing strength, because the body is being asked to do more with less. This kind of hunger rarely announces itself dramatically. It simply becomes the background condition of a household. And all of this was happening in a society that placed enormous moral weight on self-reliance. Americans of the late 19th century were not strangers to hardship. Many families expected life to be uncertain. Illness, crop failure, injury, widowhood, and seasonal unemployment were already familiar dangers. But the panic of 1893 created a different scale of helplessness. When one worker loses a job, he may be told to search harder. When thousands lose work because banks fail, railroads falter, factories stop hiring, and employers have no orders to fill, the old advice becomes cruelly inadequate. There may be nothing to find. Yet the language of personal failure did not vanish, simply because the economy had collapsed. Men still felt ashamed to be idle. Women still felt ashamed to ask for food. Families still feared public relief, not only because it could be humiliating, but because charity often came with scrutiny, judgment, and the possibility of being viewed as undeserving. The absence of a national welfare system left relief scattered among churches, local governments, private benevolent societies, ethnic associations, labour groups, and informal neighbourhood networks. Some helped generously, some could not keep up, some helped conditionally. All of that shaped how hunger was experienced. There is a temptation, when looking back at a crisis like this, to treat people in the past as if they were emotionally tougher than we are. They endured more, so perhaps they felt less. They lived with greater hardship, so perhaps disappointment landed more softly. I do not believe that. A mother in 1893 hearing that the factory had closed did not become less afraid, because fear was common in her time. A man standing outside a workshop with other job seekers did not feel less humiliated because unemployment was widespread. A child sensing that adults were whispering in the next room did not become less anxious because the sentry was harsher. Human beings remain human beings. The details of life change, but the stomach does not become philosophical when it is empty. The mind does not stop racing when rent is due and there is no wage. The small domestic signs of economic collapse would have been as intimate then as they are now. The altered expression on a parent's face, the silence after someone says there will be no shift tomorrow, the careful folding of a final dollar, the extra water added to soup while no one comments on it. What made the panic of 1893 especially punishing was that it arrived after a period of confidence and expansion. The late 19th century United States had spent years building, speculating, borrowing, and promising itself that the future would keep opening wider. Railroads pushed across the map, cities swelled, factories multiplied, newspapers advertised inventions, opportunities, land, patent medicines, labour, progress in every imaginable form. The culture of the era was full of motion. Then motion stalled. A railway that had seemed like a symbol of national strength could enter receivership. A bank trusted by local depositors could suspend operations. A household that had recently felt modestly secure could discover how quickly security thinned when wages stopped. Hunger during the panic of 1893 was not only physical deprivation, it was the shock of falling. It was the realization that the ladder beneath you was weaker than anyone had admitted. And here is something else worth noticing. The people most vulnerable to hunger were not always those who had been visibly poor before the panic began. Certainly the already poor suffered terribly. Day labourers, recent immigrants, black workers shut out of better opportunities, widows, single mothers, older people with little family support, and children in crowded working-class districts all lived close to need in ordinary times. But the panic also reached into households that had managed to stay just ahead of disaster. Skilled workers, clerks, small shopkeepers, families with a few dollars saved, men who rented decent rooms, paid their bills, and wore respectable coats. The crisis taught many Americans that respectability did not guarantee food. It merely delayed the moment when hunger was visible to others. As banks tightened, employers cut, and work disappeared, the difference between a stable household and a desperate one could narrow with frightening speed. Imagine for a moment the sound of that shift happening. Not metaphorically, literally. A factory whistle that has always blown at the same hour fails to sound. Boots that usually thump down the stairs before dawn remain under a chair. A train yard with fewer men. A lunch counter less crowded at noon. A grocer waiting longer between customers. A church basement used more often for relief meetings. A newspaper boy calling out headlines about bank failures, layoffs, silver, gold, confidence, ruin, as though any of those words could explain to a child why there is less bread tonight. In an industrial society, work had a rhythm, and the panic interrupted it. Once the rhythm broke, hunger followed because household life had been built around the expectation that tomorrow's wage would purchase tomorrow's food. When that assumption failed, everything became unstable at once. This is why we will not begin our deeper journey with the soup kitchens or the marches or the public lines of unemployed men, though we will reach all of them. We will begin one step earlier, with the moment before hunger becomes public, with the day the pay envelope stops coming home, because that is where the panic first became personal for millions of Americans. Before the breadline there was the layoff. Before the relief station there was the blank space in the week's wages. Before a family entered charity records, there was usually a period of trying very hard not to. A household sold, borrowed, postponed, stretched, and prayed. Only after those private defences weakened did hunger move out into the street where newspapers could see it. The panic of 1893 is sometimes remembered as a crisis of gold reserves, railroad securities, bank suspensions, and political argument over currency. All of that mattered. Those forces shaped the disaster. But if we want to understand what it was like to live through it, we have to follow the money until it becomes a meal, and then follow the missing money until the meal changes. We have to notice the loaf made to last, the broth made thinner, the child told to wait, the father who sits longer at the table than usual because leaving it means admitting there is nowhere to go in the morning. We have to understand that hunger is not only a sensation in the body, it is a change in household behaviour, a change in tone, a change in how people count, serve, ask, refuse, and hope. So tonight let us step through that doorway slowly. The year is 1893. The country is still loud with machinery, but a great many machines are about to fall silent. The factories are not all closed yet, but enough of them are. The banks have not all failed, but enough of them have. The cupboards are not all empty, but enough households are beginning to worry about how long their cupboards can last. And somewhere, in a home that looked perfectly ordinary only a few months earlier, a man reaches into his coat and does not produce the pay packet his family expected. That small absence will rearrange everything that follows. That missing pay packet did not look dramatic. It was not a broken window or a shouting crowd or a newspaper illustration of men rushing a bank door. It was smaller than that. A man came home at the end of the day, no money at all. He set down his hat, he took off his coat. Someone in the house looked toward his hands before looking at his face, because the hands answered the question first. Was there a wage today? Was there anything folded in the pocket? Was the grocer going to be paid? Would rent be set aside? Could flour be bought before the week turned? In thousands of American homes during the panic of 1893, the first real sign of disaster was not the word panic. It was the absence of wages. Stand how serious that was. We have to remember how close to the edge many working families already lived before the economy collapsed. A wage earner in the 1890s did not usually keep a large cushion of savings tucked away for emergencies. Some did, especially skilled workers during good years, but many households depended heavily on the next regular payment. Rent, food, coal, lamp oil, school shoes, medicine, church clothes and debts at the local store were all handled through a delicate weekly or recurring rhythm. The household did not need to be extravagant to be vulnerable. It only needed to rely on wages arriving when expected. Once that rhythm broke, the entire domestic system began to wobble. C of 1893 struck at precisely that point of weakness. Banks failed, credit dried up, railroads staggered under debt, manufacturers found themselves unable to borrow, unable to buy materials, and in some cases unable even to open because they did not have the cash to pay workers. By the summer of 1893, financial panic and industrial depression were advancing together. A banking crisis had become a labour crisis. The men who had no account on Wall Street and no stock certificates in a drawer still felt the effect directly, because the machine shop, the rail yard, the mill, the foundry, and the warehouse all depended on the movement of credit through the economy. When that movement ceased, payrolls were among the first things to suffer. A labourer in a railroad town. He's used to hearing news of business trouble from time to time, but trouble has always felt distant enough to endure. One company fails somewhere else. One line goes into receivership. One mill shuts down temporarily. Then the trouble comes closer. Overtime disappears first. A shift is shortened. Men stand outside the gate longer than usual in the morning. A foreman reads names from a list, and some are told there is no place for them today. Others are kept on, but at reduced hours. Someone says the shop may reopen fully next month. Someone else says it will not. No one truly knows. The worker goes home earlier than usual, and that is how his wife understands the news before he says a word. Imagine unemployment as a clean category. Employed or unemployed, working or not working. But in a downturn like this, families also suffered through the unsettled territory in between. A man might work 3 days instead of 6. He might be called in only when orders came through. He might be told to return next week, and then told again the following week. A skilled hand could be retained while his brother or neighbour was dismissed. A younger worker could be cut before an older one. A plant might close for several weeks and reopen with only part of its former staff. The money did not always vanish in one blow. Sometimes it thinned until it could no longer sustain the household. That slow thinning was one of the most exhausting features of the crisis, because it kept hope alive just enough to delay harder decisions. The ugliest things about wage loss is how quickly it changes the meaning of ordinary objects. A sack of flour stops being flour and becomes a count of days. Coal is no longer something piled near the stove, but a question of whether warmth can be maintained after dark. A pair of children's shoes is measured against bread, because both cannot always be bought at once. A small debt at the grocer becomes a silent presence in the room. The clock seems to move faster when money's missing. Payday used to bring relief. Now the day comes and goes with nothing to mark it. A man may continue dressing for work because the act of dressing preserves routine, but the house knows the difference between going to labour and going to look for labour. Ohmic figures give us the scale. Historians estimate that unemployment rose sharply in 1893 and climbed even higher in 1894. The exact rate cannot be measured with modern precision because annual unemployment was not directly tracked in the same way until decades later, but the best historical estimates show a severe and prolonged collapse in employment. One major economic history account places unemployment above 10% for 5 or 6 consecutive years, and some estimates for 1894 rise well above that. Those numbers explain why a single missing pay envelope was not an isolated household misfortune. It was part of a national pattern spreading through industrial districts, railroad towns, mining regions and urban neighbourhoods. A detail from the period that deserves attention because it shows how quickly financial panic translated into daily hardship. In the summer of 1893, some businesses and manufacturers could not open because they lacked the cash needed to pay labourers or purchase materials. That sounds technical when stated plainly, but inside a household it meant something very simple. A man could be ready to work, the tools could be where they always were, the building could still stand at the end of the street, yet there would be no shift, because the employer could not keep the operation moving. The worker had not become lazy, the factory had not vanished. The economy had lost the ability to keep its promises in sequence. S made this worse. The late 19th century American economy leaned heavily on them. They carried goods, capital, passengers, and confidence. When railroads failed, the effect reached far beyond the tracks. Suppliers lost orders, shops lost repair work, towns built around depots suffered. The source we have notes that by the year ending in June 1894, more than 125 railroads had entered receivership. Each receivership had its own legal details, but families did not experience it as legal detail. They experienced it as a payroll in danger, a shop running fewer hours, a cousin sent home, a boarding house losing tenants, or a grocery bill that became harder to collect. Places, the damage became visible almost immediately. Everett, Washington, offers one local example from the crisis years. After bank failures struck the town in 1893, factories began to darken, wages fell dramatically, and people started leaving in large numbers. The experience of Everett was not identical to every American city, but it captures the speed with which a financial downturn could become a wage crisis and then a community crisis. When enough employers reduced payrolls or shut down at once, there was nowhere nearby for workers to turn. Searching harder did not solve the problem when the whole town was short of work. In a household confronting this in real time. On the first week of reduced wages, the family adjusts. They delay buying something that can wait. They buy a cheaper cut of meat. They stretch soup. They tell themselves it is temporary. On the second week, a bill remains unpaid. On the third, a small household reserve is used. On the fourth, the reserve is gone. Perhaps the father sells a watch. Not a valuable one in the grand sense, but valuable because it belonged to him and because he wore it when he had steady work. Perhaps the mother takes in additional washing or sewing if she can find it, though other households are trying to do the same. Perhaps an older child leaves school to earn a few coins, or a younger one is sent to stand in line at a charity kitchen later on. Hunger does not arrive on a schedule. It gathers through decisions made under pressure. It's something that often gets lost when we study economic depression from a distance. The loss of a wage affected identity as much as appetite. In a 19th century household organised around the expectation that the adult man should provide through paid labour, the disappearance of work could feel like a personal failure, even when it was plainly caused by forces beyond any one worker's control. Men searched for work not only because families needed money, but because standing idle at home was psychologically unbearable for many of them. They left in the morning and walked toward factories that had already turned them away. They read newspaper notices. They asked acquaintances. They watched other men ask the same questions and received the same answer. No hiring. Come back later. Nothing this week. The humiliation did not require anyone to insult them. It came from repetition. Read a different part of the burden. They had to make less money look like enough food. They had to adjust the table before anyone sat down. They had to decide when a child was truly hungry and when a child simply wanted what had been normal a month earlier. They were the ones who knew exactly how much flour remained, how much milk could be spared, whether the grocer had become less patient, whether the landlord's visit had sounded sharper this time. A father might bring home the bad news. A mother often had to convert that bad news into supper. That is one reason hunger becomes so intimate in households under financial strain. It passes through the hands of the person who portions the meal. S changed before they disappeared. That matters. Histories of poverty sometimes move too quickly from employment collapse to breadlines, but families fought hard to avoid public need for as long as possible. At home, meat became less frequent. Milk could be reserved for the youngest children. Coffee was weakened. Sugar used sparingly, butter omitted, fruit treated as a luxury. Stews grew thinner, bread was counted. Leftovers were handled with greater seriousness, because there was no guarantee tomorrow's purchase would be easy. Even families who still ate daily could begin to live with a constant low-grade hunger, especially children and adults doing physical work while consuming less nourishing food. This was not famine in the classic sense, it was depletion. It was the body learning that meals now came with limits. We modern people imagine that a lost job becomes serious only once the cupboards are completely bare. But for a working household, danger begins much earlier. It begins when cash stops circulating through the home. Once the pay packet is missing, the future becomes unstable. Will the landlord wait? Will the grocer extend credit? Will a neighbour lend? Will a church committee help? Will an employer reopen before savings vanish? The family must answer all of these questions while still waking up each morning and trying to appear normal. Children still need tending, clothes still tear. Sickness still comes. Rent still has a date attached to it. The economy may be collapsing in broad movements, but a household experiences collapse one due payment at a time. Also fear attached to banks themselves. When banks suspended operations or failed, depositors could lose access to money they believed was safely stored. The panic of 1893 saw widespread bank suspensions, especially as withdrawals spread through the Midwest and West during the summer. For a wage-earning family that had managed to save even a modest amount, that loss could be crushing. It meant the emergency reserve meant for illness, winter coal, or a stretch of unemployment might disappear at the very moment it was needed most. Not every worker had savings, but for those who did, a bank failure could turn caution into catastrophe. A turn to the man who came home without the wage envelope. He may sit longer than usual before speaking. The children notice the delay but not the cause. His wife notices both. He explains that the shop is closed for a few days, or that men are being rotated, or that payroll has been postponed, or that he was told there is nothing for him until business improves. He may soften the news because adults often soften what frightens them when they say it aloud. She listens and immediately begins doing sums in her head. Flour, rent, coal, the grocer, the church subscription that can now wait, the cracked boot that must now last longer, the child who has grown out of a coat too soon. The pay packet is missing from the table, but its absence has already spread into every corner of the home. Same news arrived in 10 houses on the same block. The whole block changed. The baker sold fewer loaves. The butcher watched smaller orders come in. The rent collector heard more explanations. The boarding house dining room grew quieter. The saloon might remain busy for some, but others avoided it because even a nickel mattered now. Men gathered outside employment offices or workshops and exchanged rumours as though rumours could be converted into wages. One factory on the other side of town may reopen. A railroad might need men in a week. A contractor may be taking labourers tomorrow at dawn. People walked farther because hope often sits just beyond the next street, even when reality does not. No need to exaggerate the scene to understand its weight. The crisis was severe enough without invention. Economic contraction began in 1893 and continued into 1894, with further weakness later in the decade. Output fell sharply, employment suffered, bank runs and industrial disruption fed one another. The ordinary wage earner did not need a lecture on monetary policy to know the country was in trouble. He knew because work became uncertain. She knew because food became harder to manage. Their children knew because adults stopped answering questions in the same easy way. And most important about this moment is that hunger during the panic of 1893 did not begin with public spectacle. It began in private rooms. It began with people trying to preserve dignity in the face of arithmetic that no longer worked. A household could absorb one setback, perhaps two. But when work did not return, when savings vanished, when credit narrowed, when thousands of other families were undergoing the same strain at the same time, private endurance started to fail. The missing pay envelope became overdue rent. Overdue rent became eviction risk. Reduced meals became actual hunger. Embarrassment became desperation. And when enough households crossed that line together, hunger began moving out of kitchens and into streets, church basements, municipal relief offices, and the first long public lines where Americans who had once counted on wages now waited for bread. The first time a family joined a line for food, it probably did not feel like entering history. It felt like standing still while everyone else pretended not to look. A man in a worn coat, a woman with a child holding her skirt, an older boy sent in his father's place because his father could not bear the shame of going. They arrived before the doors opened because they had learned that late meant less, and less could mean nothing. Some lines formed outside church halls, some outside charitable dining rooms, some beside temporary coffee stands, relief depots, or low-cost food stations created because the ordinary machinery of urban charity could not keep up with the number of people asking for help. We remember breadlines most vividly from the Great Depression of the 1930s, when photographs turned them into one of the defining images of American hardship. But during the depression that followed the Panic of 1893, lines for food, cheap meals, and emergency relief were already becoming a visible part of city life. They were not yet fixed in the national imagination in quite the same way, but they were there, and the people standing in them knew exactly what they meant. To understand why those lines appeared, we need to stay for a moment with the problem that followed the missing pay envelope. A household could stretch food at home for a while. It could borrow, pawn, reduce, improvise, and rely on neighbours. But when work stayed scarce through the winter of 1893 into 1894, private methods began failing in large numbers. Contemporary observers saw charitable organisations across American cities expanding their work rapidly. In New York, Boston, Brooklyn, Detroit, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and many other places, aid societies reported dramatic increases in demand. One 1894 study of unemployment relief noted that New York's organised charities disbursed an estimated $600,000 during the 6 months ending in February, while Boston's Provident Association gave nearly double its usual amount of aid during the winter. These are dry figures on the page, but behind them are kitchens running short, lodging rooms crowded, clerks recording names faster than they had the year before, and families who had never imagined themselves asking for food now doing exactly that. The lines themselves took different forms. Not every city had the same system, and not every relief effort was simply a free bowl of soup. In New York City, 6 St. Andrew's coffee stands sold bread and coffee for 1 cent, without regard to age, sex, nationality or creed, and without requiring a long investigation before serving the applicant. That detail matters. Much 19th century charity was tied to scrutiny. Investigators wanted to know whether a family was truly needy, whether a man was willing to work, whether relief would encourage idleness, whether someone belonged among the deserving poor or the undeserving poor. The coffee stands worked differently. They recognised that some people were hungry right now, and that hunger did not always wait politely while a committee examined a case file. 1 cent was not free, but it was close enough to become a lifeline for people who still had a coin in a pocket and a need for something warm. Imagine one of those stands on a cold morning in New York. The street is damp. Horse traffic has already turned the road into a churned mixture of mud, manure and slush. Men come from lodging houses, workshops that are not hiring, crowded tenements, and church basements where they slept badly. A few women arrive as well, some with children, some alone, some trying to keep their faces turned down because they do not want to be recognised. The smell of coffee would carry farther than the steam. Bread and coffee, ordinary enough when purchased at a lunch counter by someone with steady wages, become something else entirely when bought for 1 cent after a night of uncertainty. The meal is small. It does not solve the week. It may not even solve the day, but it changes the next hour. A body warmed slightly by coffee and given bread can keep walking. It can continue the search for work. It can stand upright in another line. The relief was modest because the crisis was enormous, and modest help was often all that existed. Other forms of food relief were more clearly charitable. Soup houses and cheap restaurants existed in many cities under the support of benevolent societies, relief committees, churches, or temporary civic efforts. The records from 1893 and 1894 show a relief world scrambling to adapt. Permanent organisations had not been designed for a crisis on this scale, and they were forced to expand, improvise, and sometimes create entirely new services. The Depression created what later analysts called urban relief problems of the first magnitude, and this showed up in food distribution because food was the most immediate need and the hardest need to postpone. A family might defer rent for a week if the landlord permitted it. It might delay buying clothing. It might heat only one room. But hunger returned every few hours and would not be argued away. This is where the public line became so powerful and so painful. Hunger at home could still be hidden. A family could eat less behind a closed door, and perhaps no one beyond the household would know. A breadline stripped away that privacy. To stand in one was to be seen needing help. To wait in public for food was to admit, without words, that wages had failed, savings had failed, and whatever quiet reserves of pride had been protecting the household were no longer enough. That does not mean people refused relief altogether. Many could not afford to. But the emotional cost was real. 19th century reformers themselves recognised the indignity attached to charity, and some charitable programmes tried to soften it through cheap meals, work in exchange for supplies, or systems that avoided marking recipients as paupers. The fact that so much effort went into preserving dignity tells us how threatened dignity had become. We have to be careful not to flatten these people into a crowd. A line can make everyone look the same from a distance, but no two people reached it by exactly the same road. One man had been a rail worker before business slowed. Another had loaded freight along the river. Another had been a carpenter with no new buildings to frame. A woman may have taken in sewing until her clients stopped paying. Another may have been widowed before the panic and now found that the people who once gave her work had become desperate themselves. Some had asked relatives for help and exhausted what relatives could spare. Some had travelled from neighbourhoods where everyone was in the same position, making neighbourly assistance nearly impossible. Some still hoped a few days of meals from relief would carry them until employment returned. Others had already begun to suspect that the return would not come soon. A breadline brought them physically together, but their stories remained separate, private, and complicated. The relief system itself reflected the attitudes of its age. Direct food was offered, but many organisations preferred what they called work relief. The idea was to provide assistance while preserving the belief that aid should be connected to labour. Men were sent to woodyards, stone quarries, alley cleaning, street cleaning, demolition work and other temporary jobs. Women were assigned sewing, washing, scrubbing, laundry work, and tasks judged suitable for their circumstances. In some cities, pay came not as cash but as supplies. The Associated Charities of Des Moines, for example, employed men in street cleaning and paid them in provisions. In Cincinnati, relief funds supported workrooms for women, woodyards for men, quarrying stone, and wrecking old buildings, employing several hundred people a day during part of the winter. This was not yet a modern public works programme. It was a patchwork of local efforts, private charity, and municipal experiments, all shaped by a deep suspicion that plain relief might weaken character. That suspicion could produce harshness. In Boston, aid to able-bodied men was often given in return for labour in a woodyard. The 1894 report describes slightly more than $1 worth of supplies being granted for 7 hours of work. In Providence, all able-bodied men receiving assistance were subjected to a work test. These policies were not unusual. They reflected a common belief that relief should distinguish between those genuinely unable to survive on their own and those thought capable of working. The difficulty, of course, was that during the panic of 1893, many perfectly willing workers had no jobs available. A man could be healthy, skilled, disciplined, and still hungry. He might split wood for supplies, not because he lacked a work ethic, but because the economy had nowhere useful to place his labour. There is a terrible irony in that. The same economy that no longer had paid employment for thousands of men still demanded proof that those men wanted to work before allowing them enough food to get through the week. People did work that was sometimes useful, sometimes artificial, and sometimes created largely to satisfy the moral expectations of the relief system. A man could spend hours in cold weather cutting wood he had not been hired to cut by a regular employer, then receive supplies that would let his family eat. A woman could wash or sew under charitable supervision to receive assistance, even if her household labour at home had already filled every waking hour. The food lines and work yards were not separate worlds. They were two parts of the same emergency response, one feeding the body directly, the other feeding it through labour converted into provisions. The numbers from that winter show just how much pressure built up. Boston's Overseers of the Poor aided 3,381 families during the year ending in January 1894, an increase of 1,169 families over the previous year. In January alone, the number of families aided rose to 2,400, compared with 1,434 in January 1893. The Wayfarers' Lodge connected with Boston's Woodyard recorded 33,317 lodgers during the year. In Providence, authorities assisted 7,951 persons from November to May, compared with 1,703 during the same months a year earlier. Those figures are not merely institutional statistics, they suggest cold doorways, lines at office counters, households waiting on decisions, soup and coffee being portioned, and relief agents trying to determine who could be helped today and who would have to return tomorrow. The burden was especially heavy in dense cities, where hunger became visible at scale. New York's charities, Brooklyn's relief societies, Boston's aid organizations and other urban institutions all reported increases that reflected the collapse of ordinary household security. The United Hebrew Charities of New York relieved 18,370 families, or 50,440 persons, from October to February, at a cost far higher than during the same period a year earlier. The Brooklyn Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor aided 7,926 families in February alone. These numbers remind us that the Hungary of 1893 and 1894 were not an incidental fringe. They were a mass of working people, immigrant families, widows, older labourers, children, and men who'd been employed not long before. The panic had not created all poverty, but it broadened and deepened it fast enough that even established relief organisations were forced beyond their ordinary routines. At street level, the relief line had its own etiquette. People watched where the line began. They noticed who tried to cut ahead. They listened for rumours that supplies were low, that more bread had arrived, that children would be served first, that tickets were required, that this kitchen was better than the one across town, that some missionary hall had begun giving out coffee in the evenings. No formal manual was needed. Scarcity teaches procedure quickly. Those who came often learned how the line moved and what questions would be asked. Those who came for the first time hesitated, uncertain whether to approach, uncertain where to stand, uncertain whether being there meant that some invisible line in life had been crossed. The physical line outside the relief station was also a psychological line, and not everyone stepped into it easily. Children experienced these lines differently. A small child may not understand charity, unemployment, or the debate over deservingness. They understand waiting. They understand cold fingers. They understand that an adult's grip on their hand becomes tighter when the line moves. They understand the smell of food before receiving it. They understand when a mother says very quietly, "Hold on a little longer." Older children understood more. They knew when classmates had begun missing school. They knew when a parent sent them to fetch food from a relief kitchen. because the parent was too ashamed or too occupied to go. They knew when the family carried home something it had not purchased in the ordinary way. Hunger often makes children older without asking permission. The visual culture of the time noticed all of this. In early 1894, Harper's Weekly published scenes and commentary about the unemployed and the poor, including a full-page illustration titled Among the New York Poor and an article called Succor for the Unemployed. These works emphasize the humiliation of charity, the anxiety around labour, and the moral drama reformers believed they were witnessing in the urban crisis. They do not give us a complete or neutral picture of the people receiving aid, but they reveal that public hunger had become visible enough to demand national attention. The image of the unemployed man seeking food and relief was no longer hidden entirely within local charity ledgers. It had entered print culture. Still, it is important not to let the observers take over the story. Journalists, reformers, city officials, and charity leaders all left records. The people standing in line usually did not. We know how many families were aided, how much money was spent, how many men passed through a lodge, how many applicants sought work, and how charitable organisations described the crisis. We know much less about the exact thoughts of a mother waiting with 2 children for bread and coffee, or a labourer who had never before accepted food from strangers. We have to approach those silences carefully. But we do not need to invent grand speeches for them. The situation itself speaks plainly enough. They were hungry. They came because they had to. They accepted what was available because the alternative was worse. There is another detail that deserves attention. Breadlines and food queues did not only reflect hunger, they also revealed how relief reshaped time. A worker with a job organised the day around shifts, meal breaks and pay. A person seeking charity organised it around opening hours, distribution windows, ticket systems and waiting. That kind of waiting drains a day. Hours spent securing a cheap meal are hours not spent looking for work, tending children, or repairing the household. Yet without the meal, the search for work becomes harder. Poverty often creates this trap, and it was present in the 1890s. Relief gave necessary help, but the process of obtaining it could become a job of its own, and despite the lines, despite the coffee stands, despite the soup houses and workyards, many people still remained underfed. Relief efforts expanded because need expanded faster. Some cities responded more strongly than others. Some neighbourhoods had established charitable networks, others had little. Some aid came through ethnic associations, religious groups, or local benevolent societies that knew their communities well. Some came through formal agencies that recorded applicants and tested their willingness to work. Some households slipped through every opening because they were too proud, too isolated, too mistrusted, or simply too late. The presence of a food line should never make us imagine that hunger had been solved. It means hunger had become visible enough that someone felt compelled to address a portion of it. What would it feel like to walk home after such a line? Perhaps a man carries a parcel of supplies instead of wages. Perhaps a mother holds bread wrapped in paper, already deciding how to divide it once she reaches the room upstairs. Perhaps a child drinks the last of the coffee too quickly, because it is hot and sweet enough to feel like abundance for a moment. The street remains noisy. Carriages pass, stores remain open, people with money continue to buy what they need. One of the cruelest parts of urban hunger is that scarcity exists in plain sight of plenty. The hungry do not stand in a barren landscape. They stand beside bakery windows, grocers, restaurants, butcher shops, fruit stands, and lunch counters where food is close enough to smell. That closeness could sharpen need rather than soften it. By the winter of 1893 and 1894, the city had begun to develop a new geography of distress. Relief kitchens, coffee stands, employment bureaus, charity offices, woodyards, and lodging houses became regular points on the mental maps of the unemployed. People learned where to go when they needed bread, where to register for work, where they might sleep, where questions would be asked, where help came quickly, and where it came with a long examination. That geography matters because it shows the crisis settling into daily routine. A panic is often imagined as sudden motion, a burst of fear, but the depression that followed created repetition. The same lines, the same forms, the same unanswered applications, the same uncertainty at dawn. This is the point where public hunger and private hunger begin folding back into each other. The breadline may be outside, but its consequences return indoors. Food carried home has to be divided. Supplies earned through a work test have to last. A cheap meal purchased for 1 cent may mean the father eats out so that more of the pantry remains for children at night. A mother who accepts aid today may still face an empty shelf tomorrow. The line offers a momentary answer, not a stable household. To understand what the panic of 1893 did to families, we have to follow the relief from the street back through the tenement door, back into the rented kitchen, back to the cupboard, where every pound of flour, every potato, every remaining scrap of bacon fat had begun to matter more than it had before. That food carried home from a relief line did not enter an empty idea of poverty. It entered a room already shaped by shortage, a cramped room. A room where rent had claimed its portion before the week began, where the stove might be cold longer than anyone liked because fuel cost money, where the cupboard was not a decorative piece of furniture, but a small household ledger with doors. Open it, and you could see the family's condition immediately. A heel of bread, a paper twist of tea or coffee substitute, a little flour in a sack, a tin of lard if things had not yet become too bad, potatoes under a cloth, perhaps onions, perhaps oatmeal, perhaps nothing that could be made into a meal without leaving the house again. In the industrial city during the depression that followed the panic of 1893, hunger often looked like this. Not always complete absence, at least not at first. More often it looked like a cupboard that had become too easy to inspect. There simply was not much in it. The city home was already under strain before the panic arrived. In New York's tenement districts, investigators working in the mid-1890s found that many families lived in 1- and 2-room apartments, often with poor ventilation and little usable space. In one large sample, the average apartment had about 2.4 rooms for 3.7 people, and rent consumed roughly 1/4 of total income. Among 600 families personally investigated on the East Side, more than 2/3 lived in 1 or 2 rooms. The phrase 2 rooms could be misleading, because one of those rooms might be a dark bedroom with no outside ventilation. In one case, 11 people were found living in 2 rooms. This is the kind of home into which unemployment entered. There was no pantry room set aside from daily life, no spacious kitchen, no margin of privacy around food. Cooking, sleeping, storing, mending, nursing sickness, and worrying about tomorrow all happened within a small area where one missing wage altered the whole atmosphere. If you wanted to understand how hunger felt in such a home, you would begin with the morning. The day opened early because cities opened early. Street carts rattled, factory whistles sounded in districts where factories were still running. Men left to search for work if they still had none. Women rose to prepare whatever breakfast could be managed. Breakfast might be bread and coffee if coffee remained. It might be mush or porridge. It might be leftovers from the night before, heated again if there was fuel to spare. A child could tell something had changed when breakfast became thinner, when there was no butter on the bread, when the mug was warm but weak, when the mother delayed serving herself until everyone else had a portion. These are small things in a census report and enormous things inside a room. A family did not need to discuss hunger openly for children to sense it. They watched portions. They noticed when adults ate slowly or claimed they were not hungry. They learned that asking for more had become a question with consequences. Investigators in New York found that the amount available for daily food spending could be astonishingly low. In testimony before the Tenement House Committee, one investigator reported that among English-speaking families she studied, the average amount available per person per day for food was 11.9 cents. Among Jewish families in her sample, it was 9 cents. Among Italian families, 11 cents. Among German families, 10 cents. Those figures do not tell us exactly what appeared at every meal, and they should not be treated as a full menu. But they do tell us something essential. These households were feeding people on very narrow margins, even before additional unemployment or illness made matters worse. A depression did not have to create hunger from nothing. It only had to press down on budgets that were already stretched close to breaking. Rent made the food problem worse because rent arrived with a date and a demand. If a family had a little money, it often had to choose which danger to delay. The landlord could threaten removal. The grocer could refuse further credit. The coal dealer could decline another small order. The child's cough could worsen without a doctor. Bread could be bought in the present, but rent protected the roof over the next week. The Tenement House Committee's data show the shape of this pressure. For the first group of houses it examined, the average monthly rent was $9.91, while the average weekly income of all occupants was $9.04. In other words, the rent claim was large and recurring even in ordinary times. During an employment crisis, that fixed cost became brutal. It left food to absorb the shock because food was one of the few expenses a household could reduce immediately, even when reducing it harmed everyone inside. The mother of the household knew this before anyone else. She knew what meals had cost last month and what the same money now had to cover this month. She knew which grocer might let her pay later, and which one had already become less flexible because too many customers were behind. She knew when to buy a few potatoes instead of flour, when to ask for a small cut of meat only to flavour a pot, when to walk farther for a cheaper loaf, when to save drippings, when to turn stale bread into something soft enough for a child. In working-class city homes, economy was not an occasional virtue. It was a daily skill. The panic made that skill more desperate. The household manager was not simply cooking. She was making a series of judgments about survival, all while trying to keep the room from feeling as frightened as she felt. In some homes, several families shared space or pooled purchases. The same New York investigation noted that many Italian households adopted a cooperative method of housekeeping, with several families living together, paying rent together, and buying supplies in common. This arrangement allowed them, in some cases, to secure more food and somewhat better quarters at lower cost for each individual family. That detail matters because it shows that poor households were not passive victims of economic pressure. They reorganized themselves. They doubled up. They shared rent. They stretched purchasing power through collective living. But such arrangements carried their own burdens. More people meant less privacy, more noise, more demands on the stove, more children in the room, more risk that one person's illness spread to others. Cooperation could soften hunger, but it did not make hardship disappear. The kitchen itself deserves attention, because in many industrial city homes it was not just a kitchen. It was the main room, the workroom, the place where wages were still earned when paid employment entered the home through piecework. Tenement investigators found rooms in which cooking, eating, sleeping and working all took place together. In certain tenement sweatshops, goods were piled on beds and tables where food lay. In cigar manufacturing tenements, the committee described homes where the kitchen was always the working room, while families worked extremely long hours under unhealthy conditions. That matters for hunger, because the kitchen was not a calm domestic space set aside for restoring the family. It was crowded with production, fatigue, and sometimes contamination. Food had to be prepared beside labour, and hunger had to be managed in rooms where people were already overworked and worn down. A city family under pressure might respond by bringing more labour into the home. A woman could take in sewing, finishing garments, rolling cigars, washing laundry, or other tasks that paid by the piece and consumed the same physical space needed for eating. Children might help. Older daughters might stitch or sort. Younger children might be kept nearby because there was nowhere else for them to go. When the family depended on every small contribution, the cupboard and the work table stood almost beside each other. A bit more output might mean a bit more food. A missed order might mean less dinner. The industrial economy did not stop at the factory gate. It came upstairs into tenements and sat near the stove. Chicago offered a similar picture of dense urban poverty. In the summer of 1893, Florence Kelley and her colleagues, working in connection with Hull House and the United States Bureau of Labor, gathered detailed information in a congested district of the city. They went into homes and sweatshops, asking about household size, nationality, wages, and how many weeks the principal wage earner had been employed. The resulting work, later published in Hull House maps and papers, documented neighbourhoods where low wages, irregular employment, and crowded housing were not isolated problems, but a whole local environment. This was not a city on the edge of crisis only after the panic. It was a city with large districts already living close to hardship, and the Depression deepened those conditions. The cupboard in such a home was shaped by city prices and city rhythms. Unlike a farm family that might have potatoes stored from its own ground, or pork preserved from its own animal, the industrial city household depended heavily on cash purchases. Food came through grocers, bakers, pushcart vendors, butchers and markets. That made the household especially vulnerable to wage interruption. If there was no money, there was less access to food immediately. A rural family could be poor and still have certain foods on hand because of land, livestock or seasonal storage. A tenement family often had much less insulation between wages and meals. The city offered choice when money existed, and cruelty when it did not. A child could pass food in shop windows every day and still go home to a bare shelf. One of the quiet humiliations of urban hunger was that it occurred close to abundance. The bakery did not vanish because one worker lost his job. The butcher still hung cuts of meat behind glass. Fruit sellers still called out from the street. Restaurants still served those who could pay. The city did not look empty of food. It looked full of food that had moved out of reach. This distinction shaped the mental burden of hunger. Families did not suffer in a landscape where nobody had anything. They suffered in neighbourhoods where goods remained visible, where appetite could be stirred by smell and sight, where children could ask for what they saw other children eating. The economic crash separated access from availability, and families felt that separation in every shopping street. The meals that remained became repetitive because repetition was cheaper. Bread, potatoes, oatmeal, soup, beans when affordable, coffee weakened or replaced, meat reduced to flavouring rather than substance, cheese if it stretched well, cabbage because it filled the pot. Nothing in that list was unusual in a working household of the period, but the panic altered the proportions. Food that had once supplemented the meal became the meal. Something served alongside bread disappeared, leaving only bread. Something once cooked with meat became a plain vegetable dish. Something that had been breakfast for the family became breakfast for the children, while adults postponed eating until later. We do not need a diary from every household to understand the direction of change. The combination of lower incomes, high rent burdens, crowded tenements, and extremely limited food expenditures tells us plainly that many city families faced diets that became narrower and less secure when wages failed. Fuel mattered too. A cupboard might hold food that could not easily be turned into a hot meal if coal or wood ran low. Urban poor households needed heat not only for comfort but for cooking. A cold stove changed what could be prepared and how often. Relief agencies understood this, which is why aid during the Depression often included fuel as well as food. Newspaper appeals and relief reports from the period commonly paired food with coal or money for necessities, reflecting the way urban deprivation worked in winter. A sack of flour was useful. A sack of flour and fuel were more useful. Without heat, the home could become cold, damp, and harder on children, the elderly, and the sick. Hunger did not arrive alone. It arrived with cold rooms and weak fires. The industrial city also made illness harder to separate from hunger. Crowded tenements, poor ventilation, and close quarters increased vulnerability to disease, while inadequate food reduced strength. The 1894 Tenement House Committee recorded homes with sealed or ineffective windows, dark bedrooms, and extreme crowding. In tenement factory buildings, it noted deaths from diphtheria and consumption within months, alongside long hours of work and filthy conditions. Those facts should not be turned into a simple formula, because disease had many causes, but they show the larger environment in which hunger operated. A child weakened by poor food lived in rooms where air was bad and illness travelled easily. A parent already underfed had less strength to work or to care for the sick. In that sense, the empty cupboard was part of a larger household emergency. There is a tendency to imagine the urban poor as constantly chaotic, as though scarcity destroys order at once. The historical evidence suggests something more complicated. Many families maintained routines with astonishing discipline. Rent was tracked. Purchases were planned. Food was portioned. Older children were instructed not to waste. Meals were stretched with care. Families combined households or pooled supplies. Women walked farther to compare prices. Men searched for work in several districts. People used pawn shops, and the Tenement House Committee specifically noted that labourers, mechanics, small storekeepers, and increasing numbers of women were among the customers of one society-supported pawn operation. That detail tells us what empty cupboards often produced next. The home began converting its possessions into food, a spare garment, a piece of jewellery, a tool if there was no immediate work for it. The cupboard was refilled, but the household became poorer in another way. Pawn tickets belong in this story because they sit between hunger and a memory. A wedding ring may not be pawned first. Families might resist that, but less sentimental goods could go quickly. Blankets in mild weather, better clothing no longer needed for work that had vanished. An overcoat if spring seemed near enough. Household items that had once represented modest stability disappeared one by one. The family might intend to redeem them later, and some surely did. But in a long downturn, the pawn shop could become less a temporary bridge than a slow liquidation of domestic life. The empty cupboard looked more manageable for one day, but the room around it held fewer things. Children noticed these disappearances. They may not have understood why a chair was missing, or why their mother no longer wore a brooch, but they understood that objects did not usually leave the home for no reason. They also understood when the cupboards were opened more often and closed more quickly. In any family, children watch adults around food. During hard times, they become especially good at reading faces near the table. Did their father receive more? Did their mother pretend not to want bread? Was the smallest child served first? Did someone say there was enough when everyone knew there was not? Hunger teaches social observation. It teaches who sacrifices silently. It teaches who is protected from the truth and who is old enough to see it. The city neighbourhood could offer help, but it could also magnify pressure. When one household is short, a neighbour may lend. When a whole block is short, mutual aid becomes harder. In the depressed years after 1893, many urban districts faced that second condition. The same tenement stairwell might contain several families with irregular or absent wages. The same church might hear multiple appeals in 1 week. The same grocer might carry too many unpaid accounts. The same woman who once borrowed a cup of flour from upstairs might now find that upstairs had none either. Community did not vanish, but its resources thinned. That is one reason public charity expanded so sharply in these years. Private neighbourly exchange alone could not absorb the scale of need. By this point, the difference between hunger and fear of hunger had nearly disappeared for many families. Even when dinner was on the table, the cupboard behind it could still produce anxiety. How much remained? Was tomorrow covered? Would the grocer allow credit again? Would work return before the flour gave out? Hunger becomes psychologically exhausting long before starvation. It forces people to think about food while eating, to calculate tomorrow during tonight's meal, to make every purchase carry emotional weight. The industrial city did not allow many households to step outside those calculations. The family was surrounded by costs, rent, fuel, food, transit in some cases, school needs, medicine. Every coin had several claims on it. The cupboard showed which claim had lost that day, and then, when the shelves grew too bare, when the grocer shook his head, when the pawnable goods were fewer, when the father had returned again without wages, the burden often moved toward the person who had been managing the shortage all along. The mother had to decide whether to ask for help, where to ask, how to ask, and how much humiliation the family could survive in order to eat. She had already altered meals, lowered her own portion, used credit, combined purchases, and watched every crumb. The cupboard did not become empty because she failed. It became empty because no amount of household skill could manufacture wages that had stopped coming. And when that truth could no longer be hidden behind careful cooking, the next part of the crisis began at the market counter, the charity office, and the difficult moment when someone had to say out loud that there was not enough food at home. By the time a mother went out to ask for food, she had usually asked herself not to do it many times first. She had already stretched the flour. She had already thinned the soup. She had already served the children before serving herself, or pretended she had eaten while standing near the stove. She had gone to market with a smaller amount of money than the week before, and tried to make it behave as though it were larger. She had chosen potatoes over meat, bread over fruit, the cheaper cut over the better one, a little more starch and a little less of everything that made the meal feel complete. She had watched the cupboard become easier to see through, and still, for as long as possible, she kept the crisis inside the home. That was the first rule of respectable hardship in the 1890s. You may do privately until private endurance failed. Only then did you step into the street and let another person see that your children needed food. This is the part of hunger that rarely appears in economic histories with the force it deserves. We are told that unemployment rose. We are told that charities expanded. We are told that relief committees distributed food and coal during the depression that followed the panic of 1893. All of that is true, but between the empty cupboard and the relief office stood a person, often a woman, who had to cross the distance in public. She had to decide what to wear so she would not seem careless. She had to bring enough information to answer questions. She had to explain the household without making it sound hopeless or suspicious. She had to present need in a form that another class of people considered believable. And then she had to walk home again, perhaps with a food order, perhaps with a few provisions, perhaps with nothing yet because the case required investigation. The food itself mattered. So did the asking. Let her stay with one woman for a while. Not a famous woman, not a reformer, not someone whose name entered public records beyond a line in a charity file. She lives in a crowded industrial neighborhood in New York, Chicago, Boston, or Philadelphia. Her husband has been out of work, or his employment has become so irregular that wages arrive in fragments. Maybe he finds a few days' labour here and there. Maybe he comes home with a small sum after an entire week of searching. Maybe the family has already borrowed from relatives who are now strained themselves. The rent is due. The smallest child has been restless from hunger. Another child has begun asking whether supper will be ready soon, not because the hour is unusual, but because the answer has mattered more lately. The mother opens the cupboard, though she already knows what is there. She looks again because one does that in hope, even when hope has no reason behind it. There is not enough. In tenement households studied around this period, the financial margin was often brutally narrow. The 1894 New York Tenement House Committee reported that among English-speaking families in its sample, the average amount available for food was 11.9 cents per person per day. Among Jewish families it was 9 cents, among Italians 11 cents, among Germans 10 cents. The same investigation found rents that consumed a heavy share of income, with an average monthly apartment rent of $9.91 in one large group of houses, while the average weekly income of all occupants was $9.04. These figures do not tell us exactly what each woman bought in the market on a given morning, but they show the kind of arithmetic she faced. A household did not need a dramatic collapse to become food insecure. It only needed one loss of wages added to a budget that had very little room to begin with. The market was where this arithmetic became visible. A woman could still walk past crates of vegetables, baskets of eggs, sacks of flour, cheap cuts of meat, onions, potatoes, beans, coffee and bread. The city had not run out of food. The problem was that money had run out in the homes that needed it. She might ask for fewer potatoes than usual and try to appear as though that had been her plan all along. She might price meat, then move on without buying it. She might linger at the bread counter, calculating whether to purchase more now or save a few cents for tomorrow. She might buy a small quantity of something she once purchased by the pound. There is a specific discomfort in being forced to negotiate visibly with scarcity, while commerce continues around you as though nothing has changed. People with wages still order what they need. The grocer still weighs goods. Coins still pass from hand to hand. But for the woman whose household has tipped into crisis, every ordinary transaction now carries a little shame. She's no longer shopping only for food. She's trying to conceal what the lack of food says about her family's position. If credit had been extended before, it might be asked for again. Small neighbourhood stores often survive through relationships as much as through cash. But the Depression strained those relationships because too many families needed patience at once. I want to be careful here, because credit practices varied by neighbourhood and shop, and the records are far richer for charity systems than for every grocer's ledger. But the economic pressure is plain. When wages faltered across whole districts and family budgets were already thin, merchants faced more customers unable to pay promptly, and families faced more moments in which buying food required asking for trust in place of cash. That kind of exchange is different from ordinary shopping. It turns a customer into a petitioner, even when both sides know one another well. The woman who had once chosen between turnips and cabbage now had to choose whether to ask the grocer to wait, and after the market came the harder threshold. Charity. Organised charity in the late 19th century was not usually designed to hand out assistance casually. Charity organisation societies and similar agencies believed that relief should be investigated, coordinated and guarded against abuse. A paid agent might examine an applicant's circumstances. Visitors could question neighbours, relatives, employers, or others who knew the family. The aim, in the language of the time, was to distinguish worthy need from dependency thought to be avoidable. To people running such organisations, this seemed disciplined and humane. To a mother asking for food because her children were hungry, it could feel like standing before a moral tribunal while the soup pot at home remained empty. Think about what had to be said aloud. My husband has not found work. My children have not had enough. We are behind on rent. I have sold what I could. I do not know how we will manage another week. These are not easy statements. They are especially difficult in a culture that prized thrift, self-command, and household respectability. A woman might have spent years proving that she could manage a home well, keep children clean, pay what was owed, and avoid the humiliation of public relief. Now she had to describe her life in terms of failure, even when the failure did not belong to her. The panic had removed wages from the home, but the relief system often required the woman to narrate the consequences in detail before help arrived. This is one reason the language of charity from the period can feel so revealing. In New York, the East Side Relief Committee was created in 1893 to address the Depression's effects. One appeal preserved in later historical writing pleaded, "Give this man work if you would keep his wife and children alive." The message added that one child had already died from starvation. It is a brutal sentence because it shows how economic crisis entered family life with no buffer strong enough to stop it. The appeal was framed around giving work to the man, because that was how reformers and relief organisers often understood the problem. But inside the sentence, the centre of suffering is the household. Wife, children, hunger, death. The insistence on work is important. Many relief leaders wanted to help without encouraging what they called pauperism. They preferred employment schemes, work yards, sewing rooms, and temporary labour projects where assistance came through effort rather than through unconditional aid. This meant that the families most exposed to hunger often entered systems designed to preserve the moral value of work, even when the economy had failed to provide enough work in the first place. Men were sent to woodyards or public jobs. Women were directed into sewing rooms, scrubbing, laundry, or other forms of relief labour. In Boston in 1893, one relief effort employed thousands of women at 75 to 80 cents a day, while men received $1 a day. The numbers show that women were not merely waiting in the background for male wages to return. They were drawn directly into emergency labour systems, often at lower pay, while still carrying the responsibility for the home. That lower pay matters. A woman seeking relief work was often doing so because the household could no longer wait for normal wages to reappear. Yet even in emergency employment, the value placed on her labour remained smaller in cash terms. And once she finished that day's assigned labour, she still had the ordinary household tasks to perform. She still had to cook whatever food came home. She still had to tend children, mend clothing, clean rooms, manage sickness, and decide what could be postponed until tomorrow. The Depression did not replace domestic labour with paid emergency labour. It stacked one on top of the other. When we picture mothers during the Panic of 1893, we should not imagine them only as passive figures standing behind hungry children. Many were working constantly in and out of the home, simply to keep the household from sliding further down. There is a temptation to say that women bore hunger more quietly than men, but quiet should not be mistaken for less severe. A man out of work might be visible in the street, at hiring yards, at meetings, in marches, or in relief queues. A woman's battle often remained partially hidden because it was folded into what she was already expected to do. She reduced her own meal without announcement. She walked farther to compare prices. She asked the market man for the cheapest possibility. She applied for aid. She accepted inspection. She used the food order carefully because it had been hard to obtain. These acts did not make headlines as easily as public unemployment demonstrations, but they were central to how families endured the crisis, and there were children watching all of this. Children often understand household distress long before adults choose to explain it. They notice when a mother returns from an errand carrying less than expected. They notice when purchases are wrapped differently because they came from relief rather than a shop. They notice when she looks tired in a way that does not come from ordinary chores. In poor families, older daughters in particular could be drawn rapidly into adult responsibility, minding younger children, helping with piecework, carrying messages, or waiting in lines. The tenement world of the 1890s placed a heavy domestic burden on women and girls, especially in crowded households where earning and caregiving took place in the same rooms. Hunger made those roles sharper. The humiliation of asking for food was not always located at the charity office. Sometimes it came earlier, in conversations with relatives who had already helped. Sometimes it came in the lodging house, where other families could hear the discussion through thin walls. Sometimes it came at church, where the pastor knew who was struggling and might know who had stopped giving to the collection, because they now needed assistance themselves. Sometimes it came through a relief visitor entering the home, looking at the furniture, the stove, the children, the beds, and deciding what the family's need appeared to be. Later, historians of charity have shown how much relief applicants were examined, questioned, and interpreted by those who held the power to recommend aid. That process could be meant as careful stewardship. It could also make hunger feel like evidence to be inspected. One of the hardest things to grasp from our distance is that the mother often had to defend both her need and her respectability at the same time. If the home looked too bare, perhaps the family seemed destitute enough to help. If it looked too orderly, perhaps officials wondered whether aid was truly necessary. If a child appeared poorly clothed, that could confirm hardship. If a child was decently dressed because the mother had preserved one good garment carefully, it might obscure the depth of trouble. These are tensions built into many systems of investigated relief. The person applying must prove deprivation without seeming degraded, must show effort without seeming self-sufficient, must reveal enough pain to justify aid without surrendering all dignity. This was not unique to 1893, but the Depression forced far more families into that difficult posture. At home, the provisions obtained through relief or through a humiliating act of credit had to be made to last. A sack of flour did not mean generous baking, it meant counting. A parcel of coal did not mean heat whenever desired, it meant deciding when to burn it. A food order did not end hunger, it postponed the next confrontation with it. This is why many reformers of the period argued for employment rather than temporary charity, and why relief committees increasingly tried to combine food assistance with wages from emergency labour. Yet the household living through the crisis did not experience these policy arguments as abstractions. It experienced them as the difference between eating tonight and waiting. There is another side to the story, and it is worth noticing. Charity systems, however imperfect, did respond. Across major cities during the winter of 1893 to 94, relief measures expanded sharply. Contemporary surveys described citizens' committees, municipal bodies, private organisations, and labour groups providing food, supplies, and emergency work. In New York City, private, family, and office giving was estimated at far above the level of a normal year. This does not erase the humiliation of receiving aid, and it does not mean help was sufficient, but it does tell us that the crisis became too large to ignore. The hungry were not invisible. Their need pressed on institutions, newspapers, churches, social reformers, and municipal leaders until new relief systems had to be invented or existing ones enlarged. Still, from the mother's perspective, generosity in the abstract did not eliminate the difficulty of the first knock on the door. That moment remained personal. She had to step forward. She had to say that the family's ordinary methods had failed. She had to expose the distance between the American promise of work and the actual reality of a depression that left many willing people unable to earn enough to eat. When historians describe the panic of 1893 as a crisis of banks, railroads, and labour markets, they are describing the large machinery of collapse. When we follow a mother to the market, then to the charity office, then back home with provisions she did not want to have to ask for, we see what that collapse looked like in human size. It looked like a woman trying to keep hunger from becoming the defining fact of her children's day. And not every household stayed in place while this strain continued. Some men, unable to bear the useless repetition of returning home without wages, began to leave in search of work farther away. Some boarded trains illegally. Some walked roads from city to city. Some joined the drifting army of unemployed men who had become one of the most visible symbols of the crisis. Families did not always separate willingly, but hunger has a way of turning distance into a strategy. The mother remained with the children and the cupboard. The father moved outward, following rumours of work across counties, across states, and eventually toward Washington itself, where the unemployed would try to make the federal government look directly at them. Some men did not wait for the cupboard to empty completely before leaving home. They waited until the search nearby became pointless, until the same factory gate had turned them away too many mornings in a row, until the foreman stopped saying "come back next week" and began avoiding their eyes altogether, until the railroad shops, the mill yard, the warehouse, the quarry, the foundry, and the contractor's office all seemed to have learned the same answer. No work today. No work tomorrow either. When that happened, a man faced a choice that was not really a choice. He could stay home and watch hunger take firmer hold of his family, or he could go out farther, beyond the neighbourhood, beyond the city, beyond the county if necessary, following rumours of employment that travelled from man to man faster than any reliable fact. During the depression that followed the panic of 1893, thousands of unemployed working men took to the road in exactly this way, moving through the country in search of wages that had disappeared close to home. The road was not romantic. It did not offer adventure in the pleasant sense of the word. It offered exposure, suspicion, hunger, fatigue. and the constant possibility of being treated as a criminal because one was poor and moving. A man leaving home to look for work might carry bread wrapped in cloth, a spare shirt, perhaps a tin cup, perhaps almost nothing. He might walk for miles before reaching the rail line, then try to climb into or onto a freight car if he believed the train crew would allow it, or if he believed he could stay hidden long enough to get somewhere more promising. Historians of the industrial armies of 1894 noted that many wandering labourers used freight trains either through the tolerance of crews or by concealment, and that to a casual observer, the line between an unemployed worker travelling for wages and a professional tramp could appear blurred. That blur mattered, because the country increasingly chose to treat many travelling poor men as a single threatening category. The word tramp had already existed long before 1893, but the Depression gave it new force. It became one of those words that seemed to explain a problem while actually concealing it. A tramp, in hostile public discussion, was imagined as idle, dangerous, rootless, unwilling to work and possibly criminal. But the economic collapse created large numbers of men who were on the road precisely because they were willing to work and could not find work where they lived. Scholarship on the period shows that the tramp panic of the early 1890s was entangled with labour conflict, vagrancy enforcement, and fear of mobile working-class men. In Buffalo, for example, a wave of repression against so-called tramps intersected with class conflict and the arrival of organised unemployed groups. The label did not merely describe people, it helped authorities decide how to treat them. Try to picture a man walking out of an industrial city in late winter or early spring of 1894. He has slept poorly. Maybe his wife packed the last decent food she could spare, making the bundle seem more generous than it was. Maybe she said there would be something by the time he returned. Maybe neither of them believed it. He passes rows of houses where other men are also idle. He reaches the rail yard and finds that he's not alone. There are men beside the tracks who have heard the same rumours, work in the next county, hiring farther west. A construction crew needed somewhere in Pennsylvania. Railroad jobs opening in another city. Men who had once been machinists, brakemen, teamsters, quarry workers, miners, labourers and factory hands now gathered around the possibility of movement, because staying still had failed them. The first hunger was at home. The next hunger walked beside them. Travel itself required food. That is one of the details easy to miss. A man searching for work could not simply move indefinitely without eating. Some begged at farmhouses, some asked for odd jobs in exchange for meals, some relied on small acts of charity along the road. Some travelled in groups because a group could share information, sleep more safely, and perhaps obtain help more effectively than one lone stranger. But the larger the group, the more alarming it appeared to town authorities and newspaper editors. By the autumn of 1893, unemployed men in the far west were already organising in bands of 50, 100, or even several hundred, electing officers and seeking free transportation as they tried to move toward places where work might exist. The individual worker on the road was becoming a collective sight. That collective sight made prosperous Americans uneasy. The United States had long celebrated mobility when it belonged to settlers, entrepreneurs, prospectors, railroad builders, and commercial men. A person moving west to claim land or capital was evidence of national vigour. A poor man moving by freight train because he had lost his wages was treated very differently. His movement looked disorderly. It looked like refusal to remain in the place where poverty had found him. Communities feared that bands of jobless men would drain local charity, seize trains, threaten property, or stir unrest among local workers. Some of those fears were exaggerated. Some incidents were real. But the public imagination often moved faster than the facts. Scholarship on Coxism notes that the movement aroused enormous fears of social disorder, even though those fears were frequently out of proportion to what the marchers actually did. There is a hard truth in that reaction. Hunger becomes much more frightening to the comfortable when it refuses to stay inside other people's homes. A hungry family in a tenement can be pitied at a distance. A hungry man passing through town, asking for food, occupying a boxcar, sleeping near a depot, or joining other unemployed men in a visible band becomes harder to ignore. He forces the economic crisis into public space. He makes it impossible to imagine that unemployment is only a private misfortune. That is why the mobile poor became such an important symbol in the 1890s. They were not merely individuals without wages. They were evidence that the country's promise of work had broken badly enough to put people on the road in large numbers. Some of those men eventually attached themselves to the movement that would become known as Coxey's Army. Jacob S. Coxey was not himself a starving labourer. He was a businessman and quarry owner from Massillon, Ohio, a reform-minded figure with populist and greenback ideas about money, public improvement, and the duties of government during hard times. He believed the federal government should create jobs by funding road construction and pay workers in government-issued paper money. His plan was unusual and controversial, but it was direct. Men were out of work. The country needed roads. The government could create employment. In an era when federal unemployment relief was not a normal expectation, that proposal sounded radical enough to make headlines. The idea of marching the unemployed to Washington took shape through Coxey's alliance with Carl Brown, a flamboyant labour agitator and political organiser. Together they transformed a policy proposal into public theatre. The men who joined them would become a moving petition, what Coxey called a petition in boots, carrying the reality of joblessness toward the capital in bodily form. This phrase captures the whole strategy. A written petition could be ignored. A column of hungry, unemployed men marching across several states was more difficult to dismiss. The plan was not simply to ask for sympathy, it was to put unemployment on the national stage. Coxey's group left Massillon on March 25, 1894, with roughly 100 men. They moved through Ohio, Pennsylvania and Maryland, followed by reporters, observed by townspeople, mocked by some, aided by others, and discussed far beyond the road they actually travelled. By the time they reached Washington at the start of May, the group had grown to about 500. They were not the only unemployed army in motion that year. Other contingents formed in the West and elsewhere, some larger at various points, some more chaotic, some unable to sustain the journey. But Coxey's march became the best known because it was the one that reached the capital, and because its route allowed the press to turn it into a national story. What did the march feel like to those inside it? The record gives us the public facts more readily than the private sensations, but the shape of the experience is not difficult to see. The men walked in poor weather. They camped in fields and temporary sites. They depended heavily on food provided along the way by supporters, curious locals or sympathetic communities. Photographs preserved by the Library of Congress show them marching, resting, gathering at camps, and forming a strange procession somewhere between protest, pilgrimage, and emergency migration. These images matter because they reveal bodies in motion: hats, flags, mud, horses, banners, rough lines of men crossing ordinary roads. Hunger is not always visible in a face, but the conditions that produce it can become visible in the way people move together toward a promise of relief. The men of Coxey's army were watched constantly. Reporters turned the march into a travelling spectacle. Crowds gathered in towns along the route. Some spectators treated the army with sympathy, offering food, places to rest or encouragement. Others came because the march seemed strange and entertaining, a curiosity from the unsettled America of the Depression years. The presence of reporters helped the march survive because publicity drew attention and sometimes support, but it also turned the unemployed into objects of commentary. Their boots, their banners, their discipline, their hunger, their motives, all of it became material for newspapers. This is one of the odd things about suffering in public. It may become visible, but visibility does not guarantee understanding. For families left behind, Coxey's army could be read in more than one way. To some wives and mothers, a husband joining such a march might have seemed desperate but practical. He would at least be moving toward a possibility. toward a cause, toward men who shared his condition. To others, it may have seemed frightening, because leaving home to march on Washington did not put bread immediately in the cupboard. It replaced one uncertainty with another. Would he eat on the road? Would he be arrested? Would he return? Would the march accomplish anything? Behind every unemployed man in a public procession, there might be a private household still waiting for food, still managing rent, still counting days. The road did not free families from hunger. It merely changed the shape of the response. As Coxey's army approached Washington, the symbolic force of the march grew. It had begun as a response to unemployment and an appeal for federal action. By the time it neared the capital, it had become a test of how the government would receive visible economic distress. Would hungry men be heard? Would a petition embodied in hundreds of unemployed citizens receive serious attention? Or would the state respond first through police management, crowd control, and rules about where bodies were allowed to stand? On May 1st, 1894, Coxey's men reached Washington. Their arrival marked one of the earliest major protest marches on the Capitol, a precedent that later Americans would repeat in many different causes. Coxey intended to address the nation from the Capitol grounds, but he and other leaders were arrested after entering the grounds in violation of regulations, ending the march's main public moment not with federal relief but with police intervention. That detail often gets summarised lightly, as though the drama lies in the technicality that Coxey was arrested for stepping on the Capitol lawn. But the deeper meaning is harder. Hundreds of unemployed men had crossed a significant distance to demand work from a government that had not yet accepted responsibility for unemployment on that scale. They arrived not with weapons, but with a plea, an economic programme, and their own exhausted bodies. The official response was to keep them outside the formal boundary of power. Coxey's proposals did not become law in 1894. Congress did not launch the kind of federal road-building employment plan he wanted. The march failed in immediate policy terms. But it succeeded in making a new claim visible, that mass unemployment was not merely a private flaw or local embarrassment, but a national problem that could be addressed nationally. It is easy to look backward from the 20th century, from the New Deal and later federal relief programs, and assume that Coxey's demand for public employment was obvious. It was not obvious in 1894. That is precisely why it mattered. Coxey's army stepped into a political space that had not yet been built for them. The men asked the national government to see hunger and joblessness as public concerns, not just household tragedies. They asked for work rather than arms. They framed roads not only as infrastructure but as a means of feeding people through wages. Later, American history would revisit versions of this argument again and again, especially during the Great Depression. But in 1894, the idea was still startling enough to be treated as a challenge to the existing order. Meanwhile, beyond Coxey's better-known column, the road remained crowded with others who never became famous. Men drifted through rail towns, slept near depots, crossed into places where police watched them, and tried to distinguish themselves from the frightening public category of tramp, even when the law or local suspicion did not care to make that distinction. Some Western industrial armies tried to secure free rail transportation. Some groups were met with hostility. Some were dispersed. Some towns saw these men as neighbours in distress. Others saw them as invaders. The movement of unemployed men across the country became one of the defining social facts of the Depression years, and it exposed how quickly a working man without wages could be recast as an outsider. There is something especially cruel about that transformation. A man could spend years helping build the industrial nation, laying track, cutting stone, handling freight, digging, hammering, hauling, working where the job required him. Then, when the same economy cast him out and he followed work from town to town, he could suddenly be described as a menace because he kept moving. The country had depended on mobile labour during expansion. During collapse, it feared mobile labour in distress. The hunger of these men was not confined to their stomachs. It became attached to stigma. They were hungry for wages, for acceptance, for some way to remain citizens, rather than becoming nuisances under the eyes of officials. And not all of them travelled with flags. Most did not. Most did not join a named army or reach Washington. They simply moved. A man left Chicago and headed east. Another left a Western rail camp and looked toward a city where rumours promised hiring. Another walked through small towns, offering labour at barns and yards in exchange for food. Another tried to ride freight and was thrown off. Another slept in a boxcar and woke chilled, hungry, and still uncertain where to go next. These unnamed movements deserve as much attention as the famous march, because they show the wider hunger behind it. Coxey's army gave that hunger a banner. The road itself held far more of it than any banner could gather. The households behind them continued in the same old rooms. A mother visited the market with fewer coins. Children waited at supper. A landlord asked about overdue rent. Relief kitchen saw more people. Churches, charities, and city officials faced needs that private endurance could no longer hide. That is the link between the men on the road and the food lines in the cities. The march to Washington was one answer to hunger. Soup kitchens, charity committees, and emergency relief were another. One sought work from the federal government. The other dealt with immediate survival, bowl by bowl, coal sack by coal sack, voucher by voucher. And as the Depression settled deeper into American life, more families had to learn exactly what relief cost, not only in money, but in pride. Not everyone went on the road. Not every father joined a march. Not every jobless man climbed into a freight car or followed rumours of work into the next county. Many stayed exactly where they were, because there were children in the room, because a wife was waiting, because the rent was overdue, because leaving felt less like courage than abandonment. And for those families, the struggle narrowed. It moved from the factory gate to the relief office, from the rail line to the church basement, from the question, where can I find work, to the more immediate one, where can we get food today? By the winter of 1893 and 1894, cities across the United States were confronting hunger on a scale that existing charitable systems were not prepared to manage. Relief societies expanded their operations. Citizen committees formed. Temporary food markets opened. Cheap meal stations did brisk business. Soup kitchens and related food programs became part of the landscape of depression, not as a solution to hunger, but as evidence that ordinary family survival had broken down badly enough to require public feeding. There is something worth noticing about the phrase soup kitchen. It sounds almost warm to us now. It carries the softened edges of memory, perhaps because we associate it so strongly with later photographs from the Great Depression, men in heavy coats lined up beneath painted signs promising soup, coffee, and bread. But in the 1890s, a soup kitchen was not an image from a textbook. It was a place one entered reluctantly, after all the smaller household strategies had failed. It meant that the grocer had not extended further credit, or that the family had already lived too long on bread and potatoes, or that the last few coins had been spent on coal, rent, or medicine instead of supper. It meant food would come from strangers. It might be wholesome enough. It might be hot. It might be gratefully received. But it did not arrive without cost. The price was not always money. Sometimes the price was being seen. Sometimes it was waiting under the eyes of others. Sometimes it was answering questions. Sometimes it was performing gratitude while privately feeling stripped of dignity. Imagine a relief kitchen in a crowded district of New York, Chicago, or Boston during that winter. The room is not grand. It may have long tables, benches, kettles, bread baskets, stacks of bowls, a smell of steam, cabbage, coffee, or broth that reaches the entrance before a person steps inside. Men arrive alone, women arrive with children, older boys arrive carrying instructions from home. A few speak easily, most do not. They keep their eyes forward and move when the line moves. Hunger makes people attentive to procedure very quickly. Where do you stand? Is there a ticket? How much will be given? Is the food to be eaten there or carried home? Are children served differently? May one return tomorrow? Nothing about this is casual, even when workers try to keep the tone gentle. The people in line are studying the system because the system may decide whether they eat again later in the day. Not all food relief came in the same form. Some cities had soup houses or charitable kitchens. New York had a St. Andrew's coffee stands, 6 of them according to an 1894 report, where bread and coffee could be purchased for 1 cent without long delay for investigation, and without regard to age, sex, nationality, or creed. That small detail deserves more attention than it usually receives. 1 cent still required a coin, but it made the meal feel slightly less like alms and slightly more like a purchase. It preserved a fragment of ordinary exchange. A hungry man could place a coin down and receive bread and coffee, rather than stand under a full charitable examination. In a world where relief often came with moral scrutiny, that difference mattered. Cheap food could protect pride in a way free food did not always manage to do. Other relief efforts were more elaborate and more controlled. New York's East Side Relief Committee, organised in 1893 under the influence of Josephine Shaw Lowell and the charity organisation Society, emphasised work relief rather than simple handouts. One citizen's appeal to the committee pleaded, "Give this man work if you would keep his wife and children alive. 1 child has already died from starvation." That sentence has a directness that makes it difficult to read quickly. It does not ask for pity in the abstract. It identifies the household at the edge of collapse and says that work, not sermons about thrift, is what stands between them and death. The committee's response to the Depression reflected a larger argument among reformers of the period. Many believed that aid should support independence, not undermine it. But the practical effect was that help often became tied to labour tests, investigations, and systems for deciding who had earned the right to be assisted. That is where the price of relief becomes especially clear. The late 19th century charity movement prided itself on being organised, rational and careful. Its leaders argued that indiscriminate giving created dependency, rewarded deception, and failed to address the causes of poverty. They preferred investigation, registration, coordinated aid, and what they considered adequate rather than careless relief. In theory, this was meant to produce wiser assistance. In practice, it could mean that a hungry family had to open its private life to inspection. A relief visitor might ask about employment, relatives, debts, rent, household habits, the condition of the children, and the behaviour of the adults. Neighbours might be consulted, employers might be contacted. The applicant's story was entered into a system before help was granted. To the charity organiser, this was responsible administration. To the mother waiting to feed her children, it could feel like hunger had become an accusation that needed defending. There is a distinction we need to make here. Relief workers were not all cold or cruel people. Many were deeply sincere. Many were exhausted by the amount of suffering they encountered. Many expanded their work dramatically because the crisis demanded it. In New York, one charitable organisation recorded that demands for relief during the winter of 1893 to 94 became so great that a major annual report was delayed and combined with the following year's report. The organisation's 1894 expenditures reached more than $120,000, and the scale of need was repeatedly described as extraordinary. This was not an age indifferent to hunger, but it was an age that often believed hunger should be helped in ways that preserved moral discipline. Compassion and suspicion occupied the same room. That tension shaped nearly every encounter between the needy and the institutions formed to assist them. Think again of a woman approaching such an office. Her husband has not found regular work. The children have eaten less than they need. Perhaps she has pawned what could be pawned. Perhaps relatives have already contributed what they can spare. She reaches the desk, and before she receives bread, flour, coal, or a food order, she must explain. The explanation itself can be humiliating. She may speak plainly. She may minimize because pride remains. She may emphasize the children because adults know children invite sympathy more readily than adults do. She may worry that if the home still looks neat, officials will underestimate the need, but if it looks too worn, they will judge the household careless. This is the narrow path of respectable poverty. One must prove distress without appearing degraded, ask for help without appearing eager for charity, demonstrate need without surrendering all self-respect. The Depression forced countless families onto that narrow path. Some cities experimented with food markets that offered goods at reduced prices or through controlled systems, rather than relying entirely on free meals. Sources from the period describe a food market opened in New York in January 1894, with separate departments, and note similar market-based approaches elsewhere. Indianapolis relief organisers also operated a food market during the winter months as part of a broader emergency response. These markets reveal another attempt to preserve dignity while still intervening in hunger. A family might buy low-cost provisions instead of standing in a line for a bowl of soup. That could matter psychologically. Yet the distinction should not be romanticised. Discounted food was still needed because ordinary market access had broken down. A cheap loaf purchased in a relief market still testified that wages were insufficient or absent. Work relief occupied the same uneasy space. In Cincinnati, officials responded to severe unemployment by appropriating funds for park work and later for broader public employment. Records from the period show thousands applying, applicants being examined in their homes, and employment being distributed under careful scrutiny. In one phase, 3,140 people, considered the main support of 17,000 persons, were employed for 6 days at a time, at 15 cents an hour, every third week. The numbers are telling. The work helped. It placed wages where none existed. It recognised that unemployment had become a civic emergency. But it was not enough to restore normal life. 6 days of employment every third week did not erase hunger. It provided intervals of relief inside a longer stretch of uncertainty. And this is why soup kitchens mattered even where work relief existed. Work took time to arrange. Applications took time to examine. Committees met. Funds were raised. Projects were organised. Hunger did not pause while municipal systems developed. People needed food now. A child hungry at noon could not wait for a city appropriation to be debated. A mother with no supper could not feed her family with the promise that work might begin next week. The soup kitchen, the cheap coffee stand, the food market, the church pantry, these were all immediate forms of relief. They met the body where it was. That immediacy gave them moral importance, even when reformers worried about dependency. Chicago's organised charity response shows the size of the problem. Scholarship on Progressive-era charity notes that during the winter of 1893–94, Chicago businessmen quickly raised $135,000 for relief efforts. Charity workers opened an employment agency, ran soup kitchens, and distributed supplies to needy families. That combination tells us how relief functioned on the ground. It was not merely one soup line or one office. It was a whole emergency apparatus, trying to address hunger, joblessness, and household collapse at the same time. Employment assistance for the future, soup for the present, supplies for homes. It was an improvised structure erected in the middle of a crisis, and its existence shows how badly the ordinary mechanisms of family support had been overwhelmed. The food itself was likely plain. Relief food usually is. Soup made in quantity, bread cut and counted, coffee stretched across many cups, beans, potatoes, stew, oatmeal or other filling foods that could be distributed efficiently. The aim was not delight, it was sustenance. Yet to a hungry person, plain food can carry an intensity that abundance dulls. A bowl held in cold hands, steam rising close to the face, bread softened in broth because the jaw is tired or the stomach tight, a child eating too quickly because the body is ahead of manners, a woman dividing what she brought home before she sits down herself. The relief kitchen did not create comfort in any complete sense, but it created moments in which the body loosened slightly. That mattered. Hunger narrows attention. Food broadens it again. even if only for an hour. The ability to think about something besides the next meal is itself a form of relief. Still, the line remained, and lines change people. They teach comparison. Who is ahead of you? Who looks worse? Who is turned away? Who receives more? They also teach repetition. A family that visits once may feel acute shame. A family that returns over several weeks develops a routine around that shame. They learn the hours. They learn the faces of workers. They learn how to carry food without spilling it. They learn whether the smallest child is better brought along or left with a neighbour. They learn to ignore those who stare. Dependence, in this sense, does not always mean laziness, as critics imagined. It can mean having to become competent in a system one never wanted to enter. The competence of the poor is often misread because it develops under pressure. There was also a political meaning beneath these rooms and queues. Soup kitchens fed people, but they also revealed the limits of private charity in a national economic disaster. Relief societies could expand, churches could open kitchens, citizens' committees could raise money, food markets could sell provisions cheaply, and municipal leaders could create temporary work. Yet the depression was larger than all of these efforts. The needs multiplied faster than committees could settle them. The breadth of the crisis pushed Americans toward a question they had not yet answered clearly. When unemployment becomes mass unemployment, when hunger appears not because individuals have failed, but because the economy itself has broken, who is responsible for preventing starvation? Families had answered first. Neighbours answered next. Charities answered after that. Cities answered imperfectly. The federal government remained much more distant than it would become in the 20th century. You can feel that uncertainty in the way relief systems were built. They were urgent but hesitant, generous but guarded, expansive but temporary. They did not assume the right to feed everyone as a matter of public entitlement. They assumed the need to respond because suffering had become too visible to neglect. And within that response, the old moral judgments persisted. The respectable unemployed were treated differently from the habitual poor. Men seeking work were often viewed more sympathetically than those suspected of idleness. Families with children could draw stronger appeals than solitary adults. Relief was shaped not only by need, but by how need was interpreted. Hunger was universal in the body, but charity met it through categories. What this meant inside the home was complicated. Food obtained through relief might preserve life, but it could not restore normal dignity overnight. A father might be grateful that his children ate and still feel diminished that the meal came through a charitable kitchen. A mother might feel relieved by a food order and still dread the next visit to the office. Children might remember the taste of soup more vividly than the source, or they might remember the line, the waiting, the adult tension surrounding it. Hunger leaves memories in uneven places. Sometimes people recall the worst meal. Sometimes they recall the first meal after deprivation. Sometimes they recall the look on a parent's face while accepting help. The records preserved by institutions tell us what was distributed. They do not fully tell us what it felt like to receive it, and yet we can say this with confidence. Soup kitchens and emergency charity during the Depression of the 1890s were not marginal features of the crisis. They were central evidence of how far hunger had spread. They arose because home economies were collapsing. They drew crowds because wages had vanished. They expanded because private reserves were exhausted. They became necessary because the industrial city could contain enormous quantities of food and still leave working families unable to buy enough of it. In that sense, every kettle of soup and every 1-cent cup of coffee stood at the intersection of abundance and deprivation. The country had food, the city had food. The problem was access, and relief was the uneven bridge thrown across that gap. The hardest winter months made that gap more dangerous. Food and fuel became inseparable. A kitchen that could serve something hot mattered more in the cold. A basket of provisions mattered more if there was coal enough to cook them. Relief societies knew this. which is why aid often extended beyond food alone. The body needed calories, the home needed heat. Families required both if they were to get through the season without breaking entirely. And this is where the next strain of hunger presses in. Winter did not simply intensify appetite, it turned every expense into a sharper threat. Coal, rent, blankets, illness, lost work, and meagre meals began crowding together inside the same household, until the question was no longer only whether supper would be thin, but whether the family could endure the cold nights ahead at all. Winter changed the meaning of hunger. In warmer months, a poor family could sometimes pretend the crisis was only about food and wages. The room might be cramped, the cupboard thin, the rent unpaid, but at least the air itself was not another enemy. Winter made that impossible. By the cold season of 1893 into 1894, hunger in American cities had become tangled with coal, clothing, shelter, and every small expense required simply to keep a household from falling apart. The stove needed fuel. The landlord still expected rent. Children needed shoes that kept out slush instead of drinking it in through worn soles. A sick person needed warmth as much as medicine. A mother could stretch soup, but she could not stretch the temperature of a freezing room. And when wages had already failed, winter did not arrive as a season. It arrived as a bill. Picture an industrial city at dusk in January. The daylight goes early. Snow has been pushed into dirty ridges along the street. Horses steam in their harnesses. Men who spent the morning looking for work return without it. Shoulders drawn up against the wind, hands raw from cold, they could not afford to soften with gloves thick enough to matter. Up above the street in a tenement room, a woman listens for footsteps on the stairs while measuring the coal left near the stove. There is not much. Coal is one of those things a family notices differently in winter than in summer. In July it is a purchase to be made later. In January it is immediate. It is dinner. It is sleep. It is whether the youngest child coughs all night. It is whether washed clothing dries at all. It is whether the room feels like a home or like a shelter barely holding the weather outside. Relief agencies of the winter of 1893 to 94 understood this clearly enough, that coal appeared again and again beside food in the aid they distributed. Groceries alone were not enough. A family needed fuel to cook them and heat to survive the nights. This is why one of the most revealing relief efforts of that winter came from Nathan Strauss in New York. Strauss had experimented with low-cost coal sales earlier, and in November 1893, as the Depression deepened, his coal yards reopened for the winter season. There were 4 depots. The scale became enormous. For weeks, according to Strauss's own 1894 account, the yards sold between 250 and 350 tons of coal per day, with much of that weight carried away by customers themselves. He emphasized that women and children made up the great majority of those hauling it, trudging long distances in order to buy good coal at a price they could manage. £25 cost 5 cents. At one depot, food staples were sold as well. 5 cents bought 2 pounds of wheat bread or 2.5 pounds of rye, or 6 ounces of tea, or 6 ounces of coffee. The attached grocery operation averaged 800 to 1,000 customers per day. This was not a tiny philanthropic gesture. It was a major urban response to households trying to hold off destitution without entering full charity. Strauss's argument was blunt and, for its time, unusually sensitive to the shame attached to asking for aid. He believed that requiring people to make a public confession of pauperism before they could be helped did more injury than selling necessities cheaply to some who might technically have been able to pay a little more. That mattered because a family with a few pennies left did not always want charity. It wanted those pennies to go farther. There is a difference between standing at a counter and buying coal at a low price and standing before an official to prove your hunger. Both acts reveal need, but one preserves a little more ordinary dignity than the other. The poor who came to Strauss's depots were not necessarily free of crisis. Quite the opposite. Many were likely within days or weeks of deeper dependence. But while they still had cash to offer, however little, The depots let them remain customers instead of cases. Imagine a mother there on a bitter morning. She has wrapped a shawl tightly around herself. A child comes with her because 25 pounds of coal is heavy, and the family cannot spare another adult to help. She pays 5 cents and receives the coal. The transaction is simple. The return trip is not. Coal must be carried. It cuts into the arms through the basket or sack. The child stumbles on ice. The mother cannot drop it because dropping it risks spilling the very thing that makes supper possible. She does not come all this way for symbolism. She comes because tonight the stove must burn. Not generously. Not in a way that warms every corner of the room, but enough to boil something. Enough to drive the worst chill away from the bedclothes before the children lie down. The historical account tells us tons sold, prices charged, customers counted. The body understands it another way. 25 pounds of coal is hope measured by weight. Elsewhere, relief was more openly charitable and often more closely supervised. Cleveland, during the winter of 1893-94, provided one such example. Roughly 9,086 people received relief amounting to $37,365, or about $4.11 per person. The city's outdoor relief was given in kind rather than cash, including coal, shoes, and groceries. Every case was investigated before aid was granted. Some unemployed people were assigned low-paid tasks such as cleaning horse droppings from the streets at 10 cents an hour. These details matter because they show winter relief operating on 2 tracks at once. Officials acknowledged real suffering and distributed necessities, but they also retained the old suspicion that aid needed careful policing. Hunger and cold were urgent. So, apparently was the fear that someone undeserving might receive too much flour, too much coal, or too much mercy. Rent pressed from the other side. A family without coal suffered cold. A family without rent risked losing the room in which any coal might be burned. In working-class neighbourhoods, rent was often a large and inflexible share of income, and near-contemporary observers of tenement life repeatedly noted that when wages fell or work disappeared, families coped by doubling up, taking in lodgers, or crowding more people into already tight quarters. The Depression did not invent high-rent burdens, but it made them crueler. When an employer cut wages or sent men home, the landlord did not necessarily cut rent in sympathy. The expense remained fixed while income collapsed. That meant food and fuel had to adjust first. It meant a family might heat less to preserve the roof. It meant a woman might buy coal in smaller amounts. More often, even those small purchases demanded more trips and gave less security. It meant overdue rent became a silent participant in every meal. The sewing rooms opened in Boston during the winter of 1893-94 reveal how rent and hunger travelled together. Relief work carried on at the Wells Memorial Institute under the management of Denison House was designed to provide temporary employment for women thrown out of work by the financial crisis. The records gathered information not only about employment but about household rent, because reformers understood that rent was a central pressure in these families' lives. Among applicants who reported rent, the totals represented a substantial burden spread across households already struggling with lost earnings. Many of the women had not previously received charity. They were not chronic dependents. They were working women pushed into aid by a depression that had interrupted the ordinary exchange between labour and survival. That is the part worth holding on to. Winter relief did not gather only those who had always lived in visible poverty. It gathered people whose footing had recently broken beneath them. A cold room exposes that break mercilessly. In summer, hunger can hide behind stillness. In winter, it shivers. Children cannot disguise that they are cold. Their hands redden, their noses run. They sit closer to the stove, even when the stove gives only weak heat, because the family is preserving coal for later. A mother may tell them to keep a blanket around their shoulders while she cooks. A father may go out earlier than necessary, because pacing the room without wages feels unbearable, and because a warm workplace, if it exists somewhere, has become almost as attractive as employment itself. Adults notice when their breath appears faintly in the morning room. They notice when water seems harder to face. They notice when hunger is sharper in the cold because the body burns through itself trying to stay warm. We should be careful not to claim that every family lived in the same degree of misery because they did not. But the relief records make plain that winter intensified urban distress and that food, fuel and shelter were treated as inseparable needs. Public responses took many forms because no single system existed to handle a disaster of this size. In the harsh winter of 1893 to 94, emergency committees appeared in many cities. Some were organised by mayors, others came from chambers of commerce, charities or local civic groups. They distributed aid, arranged temporary work, and tried to prevent the unemployed from sinking further. In Salt Lake City, unemployed men received lodging and meal tickets in exchange for chopping old railroad ties and light poles into kindling the city could sell. In Pittsfield, Massachusetts, jobless men formed a flying shovel squadron that cleared snow-covered sidewalks when called upon. These responses may sound almost quaint now, but they were serious attempts to meet immediate distress with improvised work. They also reveal the season's specific demands. Winter created tasks, but not enough of them. It created need more quickly than paid labour could absorb it. The question hanging over every relief room was not only how to feed people, but how to help them without stripping away the last piece of self-respect they possessed. Some reformers leaned towards strict investigation. Others, like Strauss, argued for methods that helped quietly and cheaply, without forcing a family to advertise its suffering. Still others favoured work relief, reasoning that wages preserve dignity better than charity. All of these approaches came from real convictions, but none abolished the central hardship. A woman still had to decide whether to spend money on coal or bread. A father still had to decide whether to ask for food or keep walking in search of work. A child still had to sleep in a room whose heat had been rationed. Policy mattered, but it entered households through immediate choices, and those choices became harsher as winter lengthened. There is a scene I keep returning to when thinking about this winter. It is late evening. The stove has burned down lower than the family would like. They have had something warm, perhaps bread and coffee from a cheap depot, perhaps soup, perhaps potatoes prepared with care because there was little else to add. The children are in bed, though bed may mean several bodies under shared covers in one room. The mother keeps her coat or shawl on indoors longer than she once would have. The father sits near the stove, not reading, perhaps not speaking, because there are thoughts one cannot make useful by saying aloud. Rent is due soon. There is only enough coal for a short while longer. Tomorrow may bring work. Tomorrow may bring another refusal. The whole room is balanced on that uncertainty. Hunger in winter is not merely the absence of food. It is the way every need sharpens every other need. A cold child seems hungrier. An overdue rent bill makes supper taste less secure. A small pile of coal gives comfort and anxiety at the same time, because using it brings relief now and fear for later. The long cold season of 1893 to 94 helped teach Americans something they had resisted learning. Unemployment was not always a private failure. Hunger was not always a sign of laziness. Relief did not always go to people who had drifted from work through bad habits. Sometimes an economic system failed on such a scale that industrious families became cold, hungry, and afraid at once. The emergency committees, the coal depots, the sewing rooms, the work yards, the groceries sold below ordinary cost, and the municipal distributions of shoes and fuel all point toward the same conclusion. The winter forced distress into view. It made the depression harder to moralize away. It showed that the distance between a working household and a dependent one could be shorter than many comfortable Americans wanted to believe. And even when spring finally came, it did not erase what the winter had done. A family that had pawned blankets did not regain them because the weather softened. A man who had accepted relief did not forget the line or the investigation. A woman who had carried cheap coal across icy streets remembered exactly how little stood between her children and a freezing room. The country would move forward, because countries do. Factories would reopen unevenly. Some wages would return. Some households would recover faster than others. But hunger had left marks in habits, in politics, in the way people thought about work, charity, and the duties of government. The panic of 1893 did not simply pass through American life and disappear. It changed what many families knew about security and what reformers, workers, and communities would begin demanding from the future. Spring came eventually. It always does, even after a winter that feels as though it has settled in permanently. Snow softened along city curbs. Coal piles no longer had to be measured quite as anxiously against each freezing night. Windows opened again in rooms that had held too many people, too little air, and not enough food. Men who had spent weeks walking from shop to shop began hearing of scattered hiring. Some factories resumed partial work. Some railroads pulled themselves back into motion. Street corners that had held knots of unemployed men changed slowly. Not all at once, because recovery did not arrive as a parade. It came unevenly, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, trade by trade, family by family. And for many households, the first signs of improvement did not feel like prosperity. They felt like relief, a wage packet again, a fuller loaf, a little meat returned to the pot, a small amount paid toward rent instead of another apology. The panic of 1893 did pass, in the narrow sense that panics pass. But hunger does not leave simply because financial newspapers begin sounding less alarmed. It leaves marks. It changes habits. It teaches people things about security that they may have preferred never to learn. The depression that followed the panic was long enough to make those lessons hard to forget. Economic contraction began in 1893. The downturn continued into 1894, and another recession followed from late 1895 into 1897. One major economic history account notes that unemployment remained above 10% for 5 or 6 consecutive years, and that real output per person did not move beyond its 1892 level until 1899. That means a child who was hungry during the first winter of the crisis could still be growing up in a weakened household several years later. A woman who had visited a relief office in 1894 might still be paying down debts, replacing pawned goods, or rebuilding household stores after the worst headlines had faded. A man who had left home to search for work might return, but not necessarily to the same wages or the same confidence. Recovery did not restore the lost years. It merely began after them. This is one reason hunger during the panic of 1893 deserves to be remembered separately from the panic itself. Financial crises are often measured by banks closed, firms failed, output lost, and markets shaken. Families measure them differently. They remember the first week without pay, the winter coal carried in small amounts, the meal that looked like supper but did not satisfy, the market errand that ended with asking for credit, the charity visitor who came to inspect the home, the humiliation of receiving help while still believing fiercely that one had done nothing to deserve needing it. These experiences did not show up fully in the national accounts, but they shaped the people who lived through them. They changed the way some households saved when saving again became possible. They changed the way parents thought about steady employment. They changed the way workers heard promises from employers, bankers, and politicians. Hunger can be temporary in the stomach and permanent in memory. For children, the afterlife of the panic may have been especially long. A child does not understand railroad overcapitalization, gold reserves, or monetary debate. A child understands that dinner became smaller, that adults whispered more, that a father was home at odd hours when he should have been at work, that a mother grew tense before going to market, that shoes were made to last, that rooms were colder, that certain questions were no longer welcome because the answer hurt. even once food returned more regularly, the memory of uncertainty could linger. We know from the broader shape of the Depression that households endured extended unemployment and repeated strain, and it is reasonable to infer that many children carried that atmosphere forward into later life. Not every child remembered it the same way. Not every family suffered equally. But the crisis lasted long enough and reached deeply enough into domestic life that it became part of the emotional education of a generation. Adults carried other memories. Men remembered what it felt like to be ready to work and unwanted by the labour market. That distinction mattered. The older moral language of poverty had often treated need as a personal shortcoming. The Depression of the 1890s made that explanation harder to sustain when capable labourers filled streets, relief rooms and marching columns because there simply was not enough work to absorb them. Coxey's army did not persuade Congress to enact its public works programme in 1894, but the march made a national claim visible. Unemployment was not always a private disgrace. It could be a public emergency. Coxey's proposal for federally financed road building did not become policy then, yet the idea that government might answer joblessness with work rather than mere reprimand entered American political memory more sharply because of that march. That is why Coxey's army matters even in a story centred on hunger. The marchers were not simply political eccentrics with banners. They came out of kitchens and pay envelopes, out of towns where work had vanished, out of households where food had become difficult. Their demand for public employment was a demand aimed at preventing hunger by restoring wages. They did not ask only for soup. They asked for a system that would make soup less necessary. In that sense, Coxey's army translated domestic deprivation into national politics. A man who had spent the winter watching his children eat less became, in the march, part of a public statement about what government ought to do when private industry fails to provide work. Later generations would march on Washington for many causes. The unemployed of 1894 helped establish the capital itself as a place where national distress could be carried bodily and made visible. The relief systems created during the Depression also left something behind. Before the crisis, many charity leaders believed strongly in careful investigation, moral classification, and tightly controlled aid. Those ideas did not vanish after 1893, far from it. But the scale of unemployment forced even cautious reformers to confront needs that could not be explained away as isolated misconduct. The East Side Relief Committee in New York, organised in 1893 under Josephine Shaw Lowell's influence, became one important experiment in work relief during the Depression. Later scholarship describes the period as a landmark moment in social welfare history because it pushed charity organisations to address mass unemployment more directly and exposed the limits of older methods when economic crisis became widespread. The hunger of the 1890s did not immediately create a modern welfare state. It did, however, alter the discussion. It made relief for the able-bodied unemployed harder to treat as a marginal issue. That shift deserves to be understood carefully. Reformers still disagreed about how help should be given. Some preferred workyards, sewing rooms, and temporary employment. Some favoured reduced-price goods, as Nathan Strauss did with low-cost coal and food depots. Some defended strict investigation. Some worried that too much relief would weaken independence. Yet underneath these disagreements, a new fact had become difficult to ignore. Industrial America had grown more complex, more urban, and more dependent on wages. The old foundations of economic security, assets, labour, family, and charity could buckle together during a large downturn. A worker without land, without savings, with relatives equally poor, and with charities overwhelmed, stood exposed. The Social Security Administration's own historical overview later described those four traditional pillars of economic security and the growing development of more formal systems as societies became more complex. The Depression of the 1890s belongs to that longer transformation, not because it solved the problem, but because it exposed it with unusual force. The panic also left a political residue. Economic historians describe the Depression as a watershed moment accompanied by violent strikes, the climax of populist and free silver movements, a new political balance, and major changes in national policy. Hunger was not the sole cause of those shifts, and it would be too simple to say that empty cupboards produced one straight line to a particular election result. But food insecurity, unemployment, debt, and distrust of concentrated power formed part of the same atmosphere. When people argued over silver, gold, railroads, monopolies, and the responsibilities of government, they were not arguing only about abstract finance. They were arguing in a country where many households had learned how quickly respectable life could collapse. The ballot box does not reveal every hunger pang behind it, but hunger changes what voters are willing to listen to. One can see that in the appeal of broader reform during and after the 1890s. Farmers burdened by debt, industrial workers facing layoffs and wage cuts, urban reformers studying tenement misery, and labour advocates demanding protections were not all part of one identical movement. Their interests differed, and they often disagreed sharply with one another, but the Depression helped make social vulnerability more visible across class lines. It became harder to insist that every hardship reflected private weakness, when bank failures could erase savings, factory closures could idle skilled workers, and foreclosures could strip families of land. The country had long celebrated self-reliance. After 1893, self-reliance remained a cherished ideal, but its limits became harder to ignore. The people who endured hunger, of course, did not necessarily speak in the language of systems. Most were concerned with concrete things: work returning, debt easing, children eating, rent paid, coal secured. A mother who had spent the winter managing scarcity may not have thought, "I am living through a turning point in social policy." She likely thought about the next meal, the next bill, the next morning. But history often moves through people who are not trying to make history. Their ordinary struggles accumulate until institutions are forced to respond. The relief offices expanded because families came. The cheap coal depots mattered because women and children carried fuel home. Work relief experiments developed because unemployed men and women needed something beyond advice. Coxey's March existed because ordinary distress had grown too large to remain private. The after-effects of hunger entered policy not through grand theory alone, but through the pressure of lived necessity. There is also a quieter legacy inside the home itself. Families that recovered may have rebuilt in ways shaped by fear. A jar of saved coins kept more carefully, a reluctance to throw away food, a habit of buying flour before something less essential. A father teaching a son that work can disappear no matter how hard one labours, a mother reminding a daughter never to waste bread. These habits are difficult to document household by household, and we should not pretend every family responded identically. But prolonged hardship has always had this effect on domestic culture. It teaches thrift through alarm rather than through preference. The panic of 1893 was severe enough, and the Depression long enough, that many Americans likely carried practical memories of shortage long after their tables improved. That inference fits the economic duration and depth of the crisis, even though the most intimate household traces are often absent from formal records. The crisis also revealed how much women's labour mattered during economic collapse. In ordinary times, women's household management could be dismissed as routine because it did not always pass through a wage ledger. During the Depression, that management became one of the main barriers between a family and disaster. Women shopped with less, cooked with less, rationed fuel, sought relief, accepted or resisted inspection, took in additional work, and carried the emotional burden of making shortage feel survivable for children. Relief histories from the period show women entering emergency sewing rooms and charitable work programs, while charity offices encountered mothers who were often the ones translating household distress into requests for aid. The panic did not invent this unpaid and underpaid labour, but it made its importance harder to overlook for anyone willing to see it. And then there were the men who had travelled. Some returned from the road poorer than when they left. Some found work elsewhere and sent for families later. Some passed through camps, jails, lodging houses, or freight yards whose memory remained with them. The road taught a harsh lesson about the value society placed on unemployed labourers once they became mobile and visible. A man could be called industrious when employed, and a tramp when jobless, even if the difference between the two states was only the closing of a factory gate. That lesson too belonged to the aftermath of the panic. It shaped later debates about vagrancy, labour unrest and unemployment. When a society punishes people for moving in search of work while failing to provide work where they live, the contradiction does not disappear because a recovery begins. It waits, unresolved, for the next crisis. The federal government did not emerge from the 1890s transformed into the guarantor of household security. That would come later, and only after still larger upheavals. But the hunger of the Panic of 1893 formed part of the long argument that eventually made later reforms thinkable. By the Progressive era, major political voices increasingly discussed industrial accidents, sickness, irregular employment, old age, and the possibility of social insurance. Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Platform, for example, called for protection of home life against sickness, irregular employment, and old age through social insurance adapted to American use. That was nearly 2 decades after the Panic of 1893, and it should not be treated as a simple direct result. Still, the earlier Depression belongs to the background of that change. It had shown in living colour what happened when labour, family and charity were asked to carry too much alone. If we return one final time to the kitchen table where this story began, the room may look somewhat better now. There is more food than there was in the bleakest weeks. Perhaps the father has work again, though not as steady as before. Perhaps rent is nearly current. Perhaps the mother no longer needs to make the same humiliating visits for aid. The children have grown. One no longer remembers every detail. Another remembers too much. The cupboard is not empty tonight. That is real. It matters. But the household is not exactly the same household it had been before the panic. It has learned that wages can vanish, that savings can fail, that hunger can enter a respectable home quietly, that help can save a family and still hurt to receive, that public institutions may arrive too late or too cautiously, that work is not always available to those willing to do it, and that a country can be full of grain, meat, fuel, and money somewhere, while ordinary families remain cold and underfed because access has broken down between abundance and need. That may be the most lasting thing hunger left behind after the Panic of 1893. Not a single policy, though policies would eventually change. Not a single march, though marches would return. Not a single charity model, though relief work would continue evolving. It left behind a sharper American awareness that hunger in an industrial society is not always caused by scarcity of food itself. Sometimes it is caused by the collapse of wages, the failure of credit, the loss of shelter, the absence of protection, and the stubborn idea that people must prove themselves worthy of surviving a disaster they did not create. Families learned that in kitchens, reformers learned it in relief offices, workers carried it into politics, and the country, slowly, unevenly, and never completely began to reckon with it.